This happened in the early 2000s, back when my sister-in-law Aspen was a firefighter working with a hotshot crew of about 20 members. The team was arranged to work at an Arizona fire near the New Mexico and Mexico border. The location was very isolated, even more deserted without many people around because of the fire danger. The fire crew had arrangements to stay at the Gadsden Hotel. This happened in the early 2000s, before everyone and their cousins had cell phones, so Aspen had zero clue about the history of this hotel that had been around since 1907. You get orders to go to a location, and you stayed at said location until further notice. When the team got to the hotel, everyone was assigned their rooms. The superiors got private accommodation, and everyone else had a roommate. Aspen was the only female crew member on the assignment, so she got her own. The job was to wake up and go to work for 10 to 16 hours. Rare but not entirely uncommon, you'd work 24 hours. By the time you got off shift, you'd go back to your room to shower, eat, sleep, and then you'd be back on shift. If you had the energy, you'd sit and socialize with the other crew members between shifts. Aspen worked with the crew's squad leader and chief for about 3.5 years, so she'd take time to converse before going to bed. The first 4 days went as normal. Then by the middle of the first week came the stories. These occurrences were acknowledged, and the crew were cautiously wary about their sudden insecurity with the environment. A quick-moving black shadow, seen in rooms and dark corners, or even unseen presences, felt standing near to you. Personal items began to move. The hotel being haunted wasn't yet mentioned. The 5th night, Aspen had done her regular routine. At the end of the day, she got into bed for a night's sleep, and all was peaceful. All that was interrupted when Aspen woke up feeling a weight on top of her, and then felt her throat being gripped. She couldn't breathe. She struggled to move. She couldn't feel her fingers. Her legs flailed under the covers, but her upper torso and arms were pinned by nothing she could see. Yes, it was dark, but with the moonlight through the current, it was faint enough to see some, and there was nothing. 10, maybe 15 seconds of this felt like minutes. Whatever it was suddenly released her. Looking at the clock, Aspen had only been in bed for about half hour. When it let go, she immediately sat up, burst out crying, and flew from her bed and turned on all the lights in the room. She stayed up all night and started her shift exhausted. Aspen stayed up as long as she could for the next 3 days, taking on extra hours and spending as much time as she could doing chores on the trucks away from their hotel room. When she did manage to sleep, she kept all the lights on in her room, and slept only during the 4 to 5 hours before her shift. On the 8th day, Aspen stopped in the doorway of a crew member where 3 others were hanging out, just chatting and talking about progress being made and the past few days of being on duty. Mid-conversation, a toiletry bag was flung from the TV stand to the middle of the room in front of 3 other people. Everyone kind of laughed uncomfortably. This place is weird. Aspen went to her room. She said that night was the worst night she had ever experienced during her stay in the hotel. The air was heavy and had an aggressive tension to it. She stood in the center of the room, afraid to go to bed, but she was so tired she had to sleep. As usual, she flicked on every light in her room, turned on the television, showered, and then laid down in bed. Fighting sleep, she tried to stay up as long as she could, but lost. Next thing she knew, she felt the bed jolt, like someone kicked or shook it from the corner. She opened her eyes to a completely black room. Every light that she had turned on had been switched off. Launching herself from the bed, she ran across the room and turned on the main light. The first thing she noticed was the TV remote. It was on the table, but she had had it in her hand while laying in bed. Startled and looking up across the room, she saw on the wall a very, very large, black and dark silhouette of a man, standing 6 foot tall, in a dominant stance with a cowboy hat. No one else was in the room. There was nothing else there to cast a shadow. Aspen screamed, ran out of her room crying, and ran down the hall to her crew chief. She started banging on his door. "Anders, let me in!" She was hysterical. He opened the door confused and concerned, and Aspen immediately began pleading her case with a sudden outburst. "I can't sleep in there. I won't. Give me the rig keys, I'll sleep in the truck. That shadow thing in my room, it won't let me sleep." Keep in mind she's crying and talking, and the commotion had woken up Chief Warren, the second in command, and his roommate Carson, who both came to see what was happening. Anders was trying to make sense of her story. She got to sit down and calmly say it again. "There's something in my room. I won't sleep there." That is the final version of what Aspen explained to her crewmates. "Anders, I'll just sleep in the truck tonight." Anders, Carlson, and Warren simultaneously said no. "We're basically on the Mexico border in the middle of the desert. You're not sleeping in the rig," was their conclusion. Carson went and collected Aspen's personal belongings from the room, and she spent the night sleeping on the couch in the captain's room. She even called his wife to explain the situation, and she was very nice about it. Aspen said the rest of her stay was peaceful and nothing bothered her for the rest of the assignment. They were there for only 2 more days after the incident. No one doubted her experience or made her feel crazy about it. The crew members who witnessed Aspen's ordeal agreed that the hotel was weird, and let it be at that. When the checkout came, Aspen waited by the staircase landing, and there near the banister was the guest book. She started flipping through the pages, and there were the history highlights of the Gadsden. After the newspaper clippings and old printouts of the hotel story, there were stories of other people's experiences. People that had things thrown at them, hair being pulled late in the night, the shadow of a cowboy, a headless ghost, phantom knocking and footsteps. Later on, after feeling better, and that there were other people who had the same experiences, Aspen realized that most of the accounts had been written by women. This first story happened in Mexico, when my parents, sister and nieces and I were finally able to visit our family there about 4 years ago. We were at my great aunt's house, and her 3 adult children were also there. They have a 2-story home where they run a small mechanical repair shop from the first floor and mainly reside on the second, with the exception of the living room and bathroom being on the first floor with the shop. When you take the stairs onto the floor above, you immediately enter the open area for the kitchen, where they have a small bar seating area at the top of the stairs and landing, and the dining room with a large dining table. I was sitting on the bar stool closest to the stairs. My younger sister was sitting next to me, and my 2 older sisters were standing across the bar from me. My parents, great aunt, and my aunts and uncles were all sitting across the dining room table. My sisters and I were all chatting and laughing, and everyone was having a great time, enjoying good company. When suddenly I feel like someone grabbed me from behind in a bear hug manner, and I felt my body slightly tilt back into the hug. I chuckled and quickly turned around, thinking I must not have heard whoever walked up the stairs and hugged me, only to find there was no one standing behind me. It didn't feel like a threatening presence, but I immediately tried to debunk it by rocking the bar stool, thinking I must have unbalanced on there, or something. But it didn't rock. By this point, my sisters are all looking at me funny and asking what I'm doing, and I just tell them I felt someone hug me from behind and felt myself tilt back into the hug, and they just looked at me like I was weird. I stepped out of their courtyard, which was directly connected to the kitchen and dining room, to get some fresh air, and had only been out there for a minute or 2 when my mum came out and says, "Is it true? You felt someone hug you from behind the top of the stairs?" I told her that that's what it felt like, and that I might need some fresh air. My mum's eyes immediately start to water, and she said, "I think that was your great uncle. He used to do that to everyone who was sitting there whenever he came upstairs from the shop." She then made me come inside, and my great aunt and my aunt and uncles were all starting with tears in their eyes. My great-uncle passed away about 10 years ago prior to that happening. I'd only met him once when I was 4, which was 20 years prior to this trip. They said that my great-uncle must have wanted to say hi to us and let us know how happy he was to see everyone together. This next story happened about 7 or 8 years ago when I was spending the night with my boyfriend, now husband. Michael was living with his brother and sister-in-law and their 2 kids to help them out financially, since they were struggling a bit with the expenses of a toddler and a new baby. I would go over to help watch the kids while their parents went to work and try to help them with childcare. This particular night, the kids' parents had to work the late shift, so it was extremely late, around 2 a.m. by the time they got home. By the time they arrived, I was feeling too late to drive the 10 minutes to my parents' house, so I just stayed to spend the night there with Michael. The room was kind of small, and Michael had his bed pushed up against one wall, so the head on one side of the mattress touched the wall. He had a nightstand next to the bed, and also had a small recliner in the corner of the room. That was basically all he could fit in there because of how small the room was. He was sound asleep, and when I came into the room, snoring and all, sleeping on the side nearest the wall was Michael. I have trouble falling asleep to begin with, but that night was extra difficult because I kept feeling very uncomfortable as I felt as if someone was staring at me when I was trying to fall asleep. As much as I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was beyond exhausted, especially after dealing with a toddler and a newborn, and I just wanted to sleep. But every time I started dozing off, something kept telling me to wake up and remain alert. After about 20 minutes, I finally decided that I absolutely had to fall asleep and pulled the covers up to my face, where only my eyes and upwards were uncovered. Within 30 seconds of me doing that, Michael suddenly sits up and shouts, she's here, get the light," and reached around me to get his phone from the nightstand to illuminate the room. The screen lights up, and he's moving the phone around the room and no one's there. I'm freaking the hell out, asking him, who's here? He sets the phone back down and tells me, "Nothing. Never mind, go back to sleep," and promptly lays back down and says nothing else after that. I am in full-blown what the hell mode, and turn on the light to reveal the empty bedroom with just me and him and his bedroom furniture in it. I turn the light off and lay there terrified, eventually allowing my exhaustion to knock me out until my alarm rings for me to get up for work a few hours later. Michael goes to work, and I head home to get ready for work, but send him a message that we need to talk about what happened the night before. He tells me he doesn't remember and tried to blow me off. Later that night, we met up for dinner, and I again ask about the night before, when he sighs heavily and says, "I don't know who it was. All I know is that I saw her standing at the foot of the bed, reaching to take the covers off your face to get you." He had been asleep and snoring the whole time, and the room was pitch black. He couldn't have known that I had the covers up to my eyes that night. Needless to say, I never slept in that house again. First, I should give you a little background about me, and also my friend. I was a young, dumb kid, but was good in school, responsible, and very into the paranormal. I was close to 16 when this happened. My friend, Brittany, was better than me in school, more responsible, and equally into the paranormal. She was 16 when this happened. Our friendship centered around hanging out, watching TV, playing basketball, gaming, and a multitude of other things. We were always together. Another interest of ours was visiting haunted locations and try to ghost hunt. We both became passionate about this around age 8. We would gather up our EMF detectors, dowsing rods, cameras, and audio recorders. Then, we would descend to the chosen location. We did this for years, probably closer to a decade before we ever saw anything. The first location we chose together as children was a cemetery about 4 miles away, located in North Glen, Colorado. We rode our bikes there in the middle of the day, And when we finally arrived, we spent our time walking around taking photos and gathering audio recordings. I remember getting a lot of shifty looks from people. Neither Brittany or I understood why. It was because we were two kids alone midday in a cemetery. People were probably creeped out, or at bare minimum, pissed off by our presence, which is completely understandable looking back on it now. Now that you have some background info, let's jump forward to when we were both 16. We were sitting in her living room. It was about 9:30 p.m, and the sun was just barely glinting over the horizon as it was setting. After several minutes of debating about what we should do, we both settled on going for a drive on Riverdale Road. This is a notoriously haunted road, and many people claim to have seen paranormal happenings. Not to mention, this road has a deep history of slavery, black magic, ritualistic sacrifice, and death in general. Seriously, this is one of America's most haunted locations. My history with this road prior to the night in question only consisted of goosebumps, chills, and creepy vibes. I often went to Riverdale during the day to smoke weed with my other friend, Joseph. We liked this location because it was fairly secluded but close, and during the day, it's actually a pretty drive. Some people have small farms over there, and the area is fairly spacious. The road wraps all the way around those lands, and it's a nice little drive during the day. At night, it is still secluded and close, but it is also dark, eerie, and horrifying. I have been to Riverdale countless times, both in the day and night, and I never saw anything paranormal. Cut back to driving towards Riverdale Road with my friend Brittany. It was around 10:30 p.m. when we turned onto the desolate road. As the headlights scanned across the street, we could see the darkness absorb them into the shadowy abyss. In other words, it was very dark as we began our descent onto Riverdale Road. As we inched our way along the road, we were both feeling a little uneasy, but we decided to brush it off and continue forward. As we rolled up to the first stop on Riverdale Road, out of nowhere, a light brown wax-like smiling face with no eyes was inching from the car. We both freaked out, but then started to realize it was just a horse pushing his nose through the middle of a fence. We both felt completely ridiculous and started to laugh about how scared we got over a horse's nose. Still feeling a bit ridiculous, we continued down the road to resume our adventure. We drove down the dimly lit roads of Riverdale for what felt like hours, and unfortunately we didn't see much of it at all. Feeling a little disappointed, we decided it was time to leave and drive back to North Glen. Turning the car towards one of the exits, we accelerated forwards and slowed the vehicle about 50 feet before approaching a red stoplight. Without warning, a translucent grayscale ghost appeared in front of us. It appeared slightly to the right off the road between the car and the stoplight. It was like looking at a person that was standing behind a thick layer of fog. But there wasn't any fog that night. You could see 85% of the ghost's body, while the other 15 was completely invisible. And as we laid our eyes upon the ghostly figure, it ran from the right side of the road towards the left. When it reached the middle of the road, it was about 15 feet in front of us, and from this distance you could start to see some finer details. It seemed to emanate a soft white glow, but at the same time you could almost see through it, as if you were looking through a dusty window. I could tell by its positioning and the way it moved that it didn't intend on stopping at the car. It seemed to have a hurried demeanor about it, as if it knew where it was going, and everything in between was just an obstacle. We watched as it picked up speed towards the left side of the road, continuing off into a field where it literally faded away from existence, and we couldn't see it anymore. Brittany and I sat at the light in complete shock and awe. My heart was beating in my throat, and all I could hear was Brittany repeating my name. Vince! Vince! All I could do at this point was put my head between my knees and wrap my arms around myself, kind of like what you do in a fetal position. We just sat there for the last 30 seconds before I could even say a word. I don't even recall what exactly we said to each other after that, or how we both even got home that night. But I do remember that we left pretty quickly afterwards. In the end, our friendship began to drift for a bit, and we both took different paths. My path led me to Washington, and hers to becoming the incredible mother she is today. We've briefly chatted a few times since that night, but each time she has never spoken to me about what we saw, and each time she has refused to even address it. This encounter has stuck with me my entire life. I replay it over and over in my head almost every day because I do obsess about this encounter. I have done quite a bit of Googling on Riverdale and all of the different encounters others have experienced on the road. Many people claim to have seen ghosts, some claim to have picked up ghostly hitchhikers, and others have seen chimera apparitions that try to run them off the road. But what I find most interesting is the notorious story about a jogger that went to Riverdale Road and was killed in a hit and run. Rumor has it that he's constantly haunting the road in search of the car that hit him that fateful night. And I can't help but wonder if the ghost that we saw was the very same jogger. I hope you enjoyed the only ghostly encounter I've ever experienced in my life. It has shook me violently to my core, and I still feel the same way I did that night when I think about it all these years later. I'm 27 years now, but the memory still haunts me every day. I feel lucky to have seen a ghost, but this experience has made me more uneasy in the dark, and I feel like I'm constantly waiting for my next ghostly encounter, kind of like some form of PTSD. I also think back to the horse, and how he was so close to the fence, and how he pushed his nose so far through the gap. It makes me wonder if he was also spooked that night. One time when I was younger, my family stayed over at my cousin's place because it was a large family gathering. We were staying in the living room. My brother and I were sleeping on the floor on these mats, so it wasn't on the hard floor. It was the middle of the night, and I couldn't fall asleep. I remember looking at the clock, and it's the middle of the night, a little past midnight, and I looked towards the staircase several feet away from me and saw a white figure walking down and walk into the wall leading outside. The figure continued doing it all night until dawn. I remember being so scared and turned over towards my brother, but he wasn't waking up. I kept looking at the red number on the digital clock, waiting for sunrise. I felt this heavy sensation on top of me the whole time, while that figure kept walking down the stairs, before it finally disappeared. I felt it look at me before continuing their routine. I asked my cousin's kids and they told their mum and she yelled at me. A little while later, my family went back and I stood at the staircase and left candies as offerings before walking away. But I swear it was super scary and uncomfortable. When I was a little girl, between 6 and 8, I went with my mum to visit an aunt of hers. I was bored, and as a little girl visiting an old lady's house, I had wandered up to the second story of the house to play by myself. There was this big balcony up there with these sliding glass doors, and these really floaty, flimsy curtains that were over them. I decided that it would be great fun to twirl around these curtains and then walk away and let them drag off my face. Little kids, as you do. Now the problem is that these curtains were right above the stairs. There were no railings or anything, it was just a straight drop 8 feet down to the first floor, onto the hard as hell stairs. Little me didn't think anything about this during my game. So, after a couple of goes at it, I start twirling again, curtains over my eyes so I can't see anything, and start walking. And then I felt a hand grab the back of my shirt, pulling me back hard enough to stop walking. And then another hand, a very distinct hand, grab the curtain over my face and pull it back, to show that I was standing right at the edge of the drop-off. Thing being, when I turned around thinking it was my mum or aunt, there was absolutely no one there. Not in the room, not near me, nothing. So I screamed like a banshee and ran downstairs wailing. That was when my mum's aunt decided to tell me and my mum that like 80 years ago in the house, a woman had died on the second floor a few days before her wedding, from whatever young women died of in the early 1900s, and she'd never hurt anyone, but sometimes they'd see her standing by the window looking out, or just randomly roaming around the second floor. I mean, it was actually nice of her to stop me from breaking my face open on the stairs, but it was still pretty overwhelming for me as a kid, who had no clue. My grandmother died when I was around 6 years old, fell down a straight flight of stairs backwards. Now this was in a nice beach home, and everyone went to visit there for the summer, and everybody always noticed the top step was strange. You would miss the top step, and either stomp your foot down on the flat of the floor thinking there was one more step, or you would think you reached the top when you didn't. The flub and dismount, and ended up stumbling backwards. It was really strange, as the steps were correctly shaped and sized, but something about the trim work nearby would mislead you into improperly judging the top of the staircase unless you were paying close attention. This is what effectively killed my grandmother. She was heading up to bed, missed the step, fell backwards down the stairs, tried to grab the handrail, missed, and there were marks in the drywall from her rings digging against the wall as she went down and everything. She apparently did a full backward roll when she reached the bottom, and had done an entire backflip and cracked the back of her skull against the banister at the bottom rail. She made it to the hospital but was effectively brain dead with severe trauma to the back of the skull and brain. They pulled the plug once the family was able to come and say goodbye, but they didn't let us kids in. Fast forward 4 years later, I'm 9 or 10 and I'm visiting for summer with the family. The cousins are there, sister, mom, dad, the works. We've all been on the beach, swimming and snorkeling. In true dumb kid fashion, I have mild sunburn, and we're heading in for the day because we have some place to go, so everyone needs to get changed, and all the bedrooms are upstairs. I'm heading up the stairs first, talking to my mum, thinking she is right behind me, and sure enough, I hit the trick step and miss it. My foot stumbles and I start staggering backwards, and my hand misses the railing just like my grandmother did. My hand even scuffed the same marks my grandmother's ring made. I had drywall dust on my knuckles after this. Nobody bothered to fix the rim marks. I don't know why. Thankfully, someone planted their hand right in the middle of my back before I tripped too far over backwards and just pushed me upright until I was able to grab the hand railing. Startled, because I had nearly fallen backwards, I snatched the railing and yanked myself upright again and said, "Whoa, thanks, Mum," and looked back at her. But she was at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me, as was my sister and my 2 cousins. They were all 15 feet away at the bottom of the stairs, about to start their way up. As they were all staring at me, white as a sheet, because they'd all just seen what happened. They also told me right afterwards they saw a handprint pressed into my back, and leave an indent in the skin until I grabbed the handrail. And I had a handprint shape in my sunburn, which had marks on it where my grandmother's rings would have been on her hand. After the initial shock of everyone sharing what they saw, it quickly sank in that they all saw the same thing, and they promptly didn't want to speak of it anymore. When my grandfather finally died nearly 20 years later, we found out she was buried in the wrong grave. They couldn't find the grave, they buried someone else in her plot. They buried yet someone else next to that plot, which was supposed to be for my grandfather, and the company that now owned the graveyard was giving the family complete run-around corporate hush trying to appease the problem without fixing it. I ended up threatening the corporate rep, the undertaker, and the manager of the graveyard in a private meeting, and remind them that they were 2 weeks behind the gigantic funeral home fiasco in Chicago, and the media would love to hear this story of them burying people in the wrong places and not knowing who's buried where and then trying to weasel their way out of it instead of correcting it. It took 3 months, a state investigation, and exhuming 4 different graves, 2 of which were Jane Doe's. They had to be identified, and then shipping my grandparents to another state to finally bury them together. My grandfather passed away a few weeks after I was born. Never met the guy, never knew what he looked like. When I was 5 years old, I started to see this man in our rocking chair. I called him the rocking chair man. My parents thought it was that imaginary friend stage, but it started to bug them when I told them every single day. They finally questioned me about it, and I told them every detail I could remember, and finally they showed me a picture of the man. It was my grandfather. To this day, and I'm 22 now, every time I dream he's in the background somewhere. I remember when I dreamed about my high school graduation and looked in the stand and saw him there with my parents. I like to think he's just watching out for me and being there when he's not really there. This has made me a true believer in the paranormal. This took place right after I graduated college and was renting a crappy, very old house with my roommate, Megan, and her cat. The cat was a tabby named Ollie, and at best he was constantly annoyed. Like most girls with a new space, Megan was pretty excited about decorating. I was not as excited, being more of a submissive type. I let Megan do whatever she wanted with our walls and floors. Since we were both art students, we framed and hung some of our work downstairs. That lasted until the first party, because you can't have nice things and drunk college kids. It doesn't work. I should know. I personally ruined the bathroom. Anyway, Megan tried her best to make our bathroom look nice. We both agreed the bathroom was nice, but didn't feel welcoming. No matter what we put up, the room was uncomfortable. No matter what you were doing in there, you felt like someone was watching you, and you tried to leave as quickly as you could. We put in curtains, blinds, a blanket, and still felt like someone was watching. We put locks on the doors, added some nice bath mats, put up more lights, more pictures, and clinged decals. None of it worked, and no matter how many candles or plug-in air fresheners we used, it would always smell like gin. The juniper-infused kind of gin. Megan couldn't smell it, but she was on a mission to make that room hospitable. All our wall decorations in that room would never stay up. We tried every method possible without damaging the walls. Our new lights would pop overnight, leaving glass in the bath mats. We had the electricals checked several times, but got no explanation as to why every bulb except the ceiling fixture, which was original to the house, would burst. Why this only happened in the bathroom, why every decoration was somehow removed by morning, or why it smelled overwhelmingly of juniper when both of us absolutely hated the scent. Ollie the cat was a normal cat before he and Megan moved in. At Megan's last apartment, I'd play with Ollie and have to shoo him off any project I was working on. But when we moved, he was different, and blamed it on him being moved into this new environment. But he never got better. He would stay in Megan's room, refuse to play or be pet. He was no longer interested in jumping on my papers. That cat was terrified. In particular, he was terrified of that bathroom, that stupid, juniper-smelling bathroom. Then one day, Megan told me that Ollie had a new behavior. He watched my door all night long, every night, no matter if my door was open or closed. He watched, and he watched intently. He was tracking something. We called an exterminator. The guy couldn't find a spider or any trace of any kind of vermin. Of course, we had put traps in the basement and sprayed just for good measure. One night, I was alone in the house, and it clicked. Ollie, the smell, why some decor was carefully removed and other trashed. I felt stupid. The house was over 100 years old. We had a spirit in our restaurant. See, gin used to be a very popular drink, especially for women. In days before safe procedures, it was called Mother's Ruin. I gathered my courage and sat just outside the bathroom. Ollie hid under Megan's bed and began crying. I concentrated, and a picture began to form. She was very willowy. She liked blues and whites, had dark hair, and she was very done up, and always topped with a hat. She had a secret lover. He left her, but not before giving her something that would ruin her. She was desperate, young, unmarried, laid down in the tub and started to drink. She rid herself of the unwanted burden, but in doing so, bled quietly to death in that tub. She was interested in me because I knew she was in that house with us. That bathroom was her mausoleum, and she wanted it pristine. She didn't like the modern lights, decorations, nor air fresheners, and would stand in my doorway at night, frantically trying to get my attention, wanting someone to acknowledge her. So I made compromises with her. I'd talk to her when I was in the room, if she'd no longer peek in my door at night. During daylight hours, she was welcome to follow me around, but she needed to leave the cat alone. And finally, I would leave decorations stacked by the tub for her approval. Although she didn't like, she would move away from the tub, so we could not use them. She liked our photos from a project about crumbling old structures. She never did make peace with the cat, and when I was ready to move out, she turned that juniper up full blast next to my pillow for a week. She was spoiled in life and lonely in death. I tried to persuade her that better things awaited her, but she was very stubborn about her bathroom. Who would keep nice things? Who would watch over the area she saw as a grave marker? I told her it wasn't even the same tub, and she knocked a photo off the wall. I know my friend has since moved on, and someone else lives there now. I just hope whoever lives there has a lot of patience, because the lady in the bath isn't going anywhere. This is my mother's story, and I believe her. It's about a creature she used to call the Night Mother. In the late 60s/early 70s, she moved with her family to her grandmother's house in Rhineland, Germany. The house was big and old, a classy ghost house with a big garden and farmland they had to work on. The grandmother was a mean creature. My grandparents had 7 children, one of the boys, the eldest, who got his own room, and 6 girls who had to share the other. The girls were between the ages of 4 and 12. That's when it all started. They all claim that at nights, when they would lie in bed, 2 of them sharing one, a woman dressed in black would visit their room. She would stand at the foot of each bed, sometimes tugging at them a little bit closer with the blankets and watching them. She had skeletal fingers. Never spoke to them. It wasn't every night, but it was quite regular, and they were all scared to death every time it happened. No one moved or said anything, just stared at her. A few of the younger ones would be already asleep. They gave her the name Abendmutter, which in German translates to Night Mother. And they say that they didn't have the feeling that she was evil, but more protecting. Of course they were scared of her, because who wouldn't be? One aunt remembers that in the first night she whispered, "Can you see that too?" to her sister, who nodded. They can't remember if they ever tried speaking to her. When they told their parents, it was pushed off as a nightmare, and no one really cared at the time. Everyone was working 12-hour days, even the children often helping them. Every one of my aunts remembered this story, and they don't talk about it often, and feel uncomfortable when I asked about it as a kid, but they are all 100% convinced it occurred. I tried a lot of explanations, mass hallucinations, their grandmother dressing up and being a psychopath torturing her grandchildren, maybe coping with the trauma they all shared together, but I could never really be sure what they saw or why. I used to work in the hotel industry and left the profession for a year due to my course at university getting quite difficult for a few semesters. I came back to it, to do some part-time work manning the front desk on a Friday and Saturday night, as a night auditor. A few things of how the hotel was built was that there was a car park level directly above the reception and main entrance area. Guests could only access it after calling the front desk, and you would have to manually walk through the car park to open the gated entrance. No one else had access to it, except front desk. I was going through the whole on-the-job training when the receptionist who was training me told me some stories about the hotel, including all the suicides they'd had. What was told to me was that on his watch, he'd had 3, where people had jumped off the balcony or fallen and landed in the car park. What I can't forget, and has stuck to me, was how he described the noise of them landing in the car park level. He said it sounded like a bomb had gone off, and the whole reception area would shake for a few seconds. He then told me about the incidents of staff, especially porters, seeing shadows and people in their rearview mirror when moving the cars around to make more rooms for other cars. There was one story when someone, who had newly started working at the hotel, was called on by a guest to grab something out of the car for him to bring up to his room. He had only gone up to the car park level for a few minutes when other staff, housekeeping, heard screaming coming from that level and someone running down the stairwell trying to frantically open the door to the main foyer. Luckily, there weren't any guests checking in at that very moment, as he had collapsed on the floor screaming that he saw someone walk up to the car and peer into the window while he was searching for whatever the guest had asked him to grab, and when he looked up, he was gone. When I was 13, I experienced the ghost of my grandmother. She died in her sleep while taking a nap on the living room couch. Afterwards, according to my father and grandfather, every now and then you can hear her make the trip from the bedroom to the kitchen and open the refrigerator door. A trip she made many times when she was alive. At first, I thought my father and grandfather were making this up, having fun at my expense. A few years later, after she passed, my father and I went to spend the weekend with my grandfather. My father and I slept on the living room couch. It opened into a double bed, the same couch my grandmother died on. My grandfather left the house to go to a next-door neighbor's house to play poker. My father and I went to bed in the living room, and my father went right to sleep. I laid awake reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the noise of the back bedroom being pulled open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet, and I heard the creak of the floor directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I heard more shuffling feet. Then I heard the fridge door being pulled open, and I heard the sound of a glass bottle in the fridge, the door clink against each other. Back then they were still putting soft drinks in glass bottles, and feeling thirsty I decided to go out of bed and join my grandfather in the kitchen for a cold drink. But when I arrive, I'm all alone. I was puzzled. I could have sworn I heard my grandfather walk from the bedroom into the kitchen and open the fridge. That's when I remembered that he wasn't home. He was at the neighbor's house and had not returned. And that's when I remembered the ghost story, and a cold chill went down my spine. I raced from the kitchen into the living room and leapt over my sleeping father into my side of the bed. I then went to sleep. I don't know for how long, but I woke up with a start and felt a feeling of paralysis take over my body. I was frozen. I was lying on my right side, and it took me a while to work up the courage to turn my head to the left. My head was covered by a blanket. There was a shadow being cast on it. The shadow had the outline of a head and shoulder of a woman with a beehive hairdo. My grandma used to have a beehive hairdo for years, even after it went out of style up until she died, and I heard heavy breathing coming from the shadow. I had to work up the courage to move one of my hands to remove the blanket, and when I did, the paralyzing fear was gone, as was the shadow and the sound of heavy breathing. My father was still sleeping, and I pulled the blanket back over my head and slept on, only to wake up again on my right side. The paralyzing fear was back. Forcing myself to turn my head, the shadow was back, so was the heavy breathing. Again I had to summon up all my courage to move my hand and take the blanket off my face, only to find nothing there and the crippling fear gone. I went through this same routine the entire night. I lost count how many times it happened through it, maybe a dozen, maybe more. The next morning I told my father what happened to me through the entire night while he slept. The sounds of the bedroom door opening, the shuffling feet, the fridge door opening, no one in the kitchen, and being awakened with paralyzing fear. The shadow, the heavy breathing, the repeat performances throughout the night. I kind of expected him to tell me I was just seeing and hearing things, but instead, he smiled. "That was Grandma," he said. I was a leasing agent. We deal with a surprisingly high amount of deaths. Brant was my worst suicide and most creepy. I'll never forget him, and he made sure of that. Brant was a weird resident, but nice, always chatted with me, and you could tell he was hurting from his PTSD. Around Christmas, his packages sat too long in the office for pickup, and I figured he was on vacation. Shortly after New Year's, his parents called and asked to speak to me directly. Manager hands me the phone, and they tell me they haven't been able to get a hold of him for weeks, as they live out of state. I tell them to call the police department, as we're not allowed due to privacy laws, and I grab my keys and head for his apartment. His dog, Ricky, was barking. I check the front door and it cracks open, and the smell hit my face like a ton of bricks. He's dead, and had been dead. The police arrive. Turns out Brant shot himself and sat for 10 days. I had to ID him before they called his family. The dog actually started to eat him, due to not going out for so long. The residents above and on the side and behind noped out, and we let them go. At this point I think I'm losing my mind, because I keep seeing Brant out of the corner of my eyes at work. Only at work. Sometimes I'd see him walk by the office window, and I would yell for my manager, who believed me, but thankfully she never saw him. After about a month of this, we get his place cleaned up and turned over the apartments to a pair of little Korean sisters who moved in next door. The apartment shares a wall with his bedroom. At this point, no one in the area knows what happened, and because of Brant being a shut-in, no one knew him or who he was. Cookie, one of the sisters, comes in and asks me one day if someone died in their apartment. I tell her no. She says there's a man around her apartment and is distraught about not being able to cross over. At this point, I ask her if she's seen him, and she describes Brant. I tell her about what happened, and she assures me she'll do a crossover ceremony for him that evening, and also gave me a bit of sage later that day. I never saw or felt Brant again after that night. As a child at the age of 4 in the late 60s, we lived in a brand new house. Next to it was a small footpath, and then a wild overgrown field, then a main road, and then the castle that was built in the 14th century. Hilton Castle specifically. At that age I had absolutely no concept of what a ghost was. My father used to check on us, my brother and I, to see if we were okay once we'd gone to bed. One night, I was awoken by a tapping on my shoulder, and was facing the wall when this happened. I ignored it firstly. Then the tapping began again and I felt it more rapid. I thought it might be my dad, and I said that I was okay, but the tapping didn't stop, so I turned around. What I see has stuck with me since. There was a boy, with a thin, pale face with mousy straight hair that looked like a bob. My first thought was, "Who are you?" But with him being so close to my face, his eyes stood out. I could understand why ghosts are depicted and are seen as having no eyes, but he did. Yet they were a thin veil. It reminds me of what a bubble does just before bursting. You could see through his eyes, and this absolutely terrified me, in which I shot under the blankets, out of the other end of my bed. I went screaming into my parents' bedroom and screaming that there was someone there. Odd things at the house happened now and then. My older brother once saw a soldier in the bedroom door. He woke me up when this happened and I sat on the bed to see. What I saw was a brief silhouette at the door. looking at it, as if it were taking a swipe at the bedroom light switch with a sword. We were both frozen until it disappeared. My older brother thought it was a medieval soldier, but by the shape of its head, which looked like a helmet. Sometime later, my uncle, who was coming to the house to babysat us, thought he saw a man in medieval fancy dress coming towards him, in which my uncle said, "Hello," but was utterly freaked out when he saw this person walk through the wall of the house. He said he was terrified by it. Sometime later, when I was older, I heard the story of the ghost that haunts the castle, the called Lad of Hilton. After reading the tragic story of Lad, I did wonder if he had visited other children at night, and I wish I had just asked him what he wanted. I heard lots of people have seen him through the years and hope he's at peace now. Not me or my brother has any knowledge or history in any sense, nor my uncle has no interest in history. And this is all key to understand what we'd seen. It was last year around summer when this happened. My sister and I were in the same bed, and we had one of our windows slightly open because it was very hot in the night. I remember it being about 1:30 in the morning. I was awake and getting a drink from my bedside table when I heard it, scratching at my door. At first I thought it was my mother or father, because they tend to say goodnight to us, but then I realized they were both in bed. So I naturally panicked, and while I panicked, the scratching continued louder and louder. It sounded like long fingernails being dragged on the wooden door, and it got deeper, then louder, until it just stopped. Again last year my sister was in my bed, and for context I sleep with a nightlight as I'm terrified of the dark. My bathroom is directly in front of my bedroom door across the landing, so I wake up around 2 in the morning and I need to go to the toilet. I make my way across the landing and leave the toilet light off because my nightlight was barely lighting the room. I sit on the toilet when I see it. A blank face peeking out of the door looking at me. It had no eyes, no mouth, but I could see a nose and short hair. It was just watching me go to the toilet. I sprinted out, woke my sister, and tried to show her the entity, but when I brought her, it was gone. It still freaks me out to this day. I'm a people person, so it didn't take me long to work my way up the ladder at our hotel. I loved that hotel. It was really old, built in 1967, and despite the shambles it was in when I worked there, it used to be the most happening place in town. The decor was unlike a lot of hotels you see today. Elaborate chandeliers and imported Spanish tiles, and a beautiful handmade stained-glassed skylight. A lot of people were shocked our rooms were only $50 a night, but it wasn't long before I realized that something was just off about that place. We had this service hallway that connected our kitchen and storage rooms to all of our conference rooms. It was my first day, and I was taking the tour of the facility with my manager while he showed me around. I noticed how it smelt like a nursing home, like mothballs and death, and it was just unnaturally cold, especially for Louisiana in the spring. The deeper we go down the hallway, I began to feel sick, but I put it off as nerves. But whatever it is in that hallway/kitchen scared the hell out of me for a few weeks. I was working the 3 to 11 shift. At around 8 or 9 p.m., I went to find a guest some silverware in the kitchen. I was still pretty new there, so after searching for the light switch, I give up and use my phone to grab the silverware. That's when I noticed the sound of footsteps, really fast footsteps. I turn around to see something run right past me into the dark, knocking over the stack of chafing dishes on the prep table. Needless to say, I said screw the silverware and ran the hell out of there, and ended up calling the housekeeper who stayed in the hotel occasionally to grab it from the kitchen. But she said that when she went in, no one was there. No one who worked there wanted to go into that hallway. Even the cook, who would bring her granddaughter with her in the morning to keep her company while she got breakfast started. No one ever knew exactly what was back there. But again, I guess we just didn't want to find out. After that experience, I was sufficiently scared, but curious. I had become friends with one of our elderly breakfast cooks, a little woman in her 70s, we called Mrs. J. She mentioned that she'd been working there since the early 70s, and she began to tell me stories that made me never look at the hotel the same again. The owner was a cheap guy, even when I worked there. He didn't want to purchase actual security cameras for the entire property, so instead, he installed 2 actual cameras in the lobby, one at each entrance, and one by the pool, but placed a mock camera down the hall and by the rooms, giving the appearance of security, when actually they were just plastic boxes. One night, a young lady checked in, stinking drunk by herself at 1 a.m. She requested a smoking room, which are only located in the back side of the property on the 2nd floor. This area also has one of the many blind spots from our cameras. She goes to her room. No one hears from her for the rest of the night, until the housekeeper shows up in the morning to find the woman in the parking lot, covered in blood and whiskey and bloated. Apparently, after she checked in, she continued her binge on the balcony facing the parking lot. She must have fallen off and bled to death in the parking lot. The horrifying part is that she must have still been alive after the fall, because the trail of blood behind her almost looked like she was trying to crawl for help. And of course, because there were no cameras, the front desk was blissfully unaware. We always had problems in that wing of the hotel after. Domestic violence cases always came out of that wing. People's tempers just seemed to skyrocket when they stayed there. Another story she told me, that I ended up experiencing. There was a country singer named Charlie Rich, who died in one of our suites. Our suites were located inside the actual lobby facing the front desk. He had a pulmonary embolism while his wife was eating breakfast in our restaurant. Mrs. J was even there when his wife found him dead. Room 208. Ever since, a lot of customers complained of people knocking on their doors at odd hours, but the front desk never saw anyone go up to the room. One customer came running out in the middle of the night. He ran up to my night auditor and told him there was a man in his room. Of course, when someone went to investigate, there was no sign of an intruder. A lot of the times when the room would stay vacant for a while, the TV would turn on by itself. I even saw it once through the open window. It just turned on. And always to the same channel, CMT, Channel 71. Charlie never really bothered the staff. I'd even find myself talking to Charlie on our more quiet nights. Sometimes I even played my old country playlist for him. I ended up quitting after working there for 5 years. The owner was doing some sketchy things with my paycheck, so I said my final farewells to the hotel that I had grown to love so much. Not even a year after I left, the owner suddenly shut down the hotel. Not sure why, but all of the employees were told to not come back the next day, or ever. All of the papers, computers, furniture, and food, all left inside the massive, vacant, blood-red building. One Sunday morning I was in my kitchen having a cup of tea with my wife. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what I thought was my 3-year-old daughter, basically a small blonde girl in a white nightie, walk out of the front room and into the entrance hall. I went to see what she was doing, and when I got there, no one was there. I walked back into the kitchen and said to my wife something along the lines of, "I'm bloody seeing things. I could have sworn I saw Amelia walking to the front door, but when she got there was no one to be seen." My wife was all like, "You're joking. The same thing happened to me and my mum the other day." She explained how the same thing happened to them in the exact same spot with the mysterious girl taking the exact same route. In fact, so convinced that they had seen our daughter, that they crept into the entrance hall after her to make a jump, but there was no one there. It didn't end there though. A few months later, we saw a post on a local Facebook page saying, "I had a lovely childhood growing up at our address. I've been really keen to speak to whoever lives there now, particularly if they've had any experiences with the paranormal." I direct messaged the poster and asked if she had ever seen anything untoward without giving any indication of what we had experienced. Lo and behold, her and her sister used to see a little blonde Victorian girl in a white nightie standing outside their bedroom door or walking through the house. She related how, initially, they would think that it was the other sister, but they would go to investigate and find no one there. I'm a very cynical person by nature, and did not previously believe in the paranormal, but now I have no alternate explanation. I was at my grandpa's house in southern Indiana at the time. He had a really long driveway, so I drove a golf cart to get the mail. As I was coming up, I swear I saw my great-grandpa, who had been dead for a few years by then. I looked over at the passenger side and saw him smiling at me. It scared me so much I slammed on the brakes and looked back, but he was gone. Then I saw something running into the woods that looked like a human. I tried to drive away but was stuck in mud, so I got out and ran the rest of the way. I told everyone, and they ran down to check. As they were going, my aunt told me that ever since we got their grandpa's dog, he'd been acting crazy, so we think someone was out there. There was also a short story where in the 4th of July my sister saw a toddler roll down the hill and hit her head. She panicked, told my mum, and by the time they looked back, the girl was gone. Judging by how scared my sister was, she couldn't have faked it either. My family has experienced a lot of things just like that. I live in a small country town in the Irish Midlands. I went to a secondary school about 20 miles away from home, in the main town of the county I live in, so naturally I made a lot of friends that side of the county and hung out there as I got older. Fast forward after finishing school for good. In my late teens, I used to go out at the weekends and hang out with my mates and get drunk. We would mostly go to any metal gigs that were in pubs and such, as that was the scene we were into. There was one bar that we used to frequent quite a bit that was located in the cellar of an old orphanage that was renovated into apartments some time ago. Sadly, there was a tragic history, an incident that happened in the orphanage in the early 1940s, which saw a fire break out and the loss of more than 30 lives, all of them young girls. The reason that the orphans were not evacuated from the fire was because the nuns didn't think it decent for the girls to be seen in their nightgowns, so they were locked inside as members of the public tried to put out the fire. The poor children perished. The nuns survived. So I know one of the guys who worked in this cellar bar, and one night he told me that in the back cooler room where they kept their beer kegs, he and other staff could sometimes smell smoke and feel a bit dizzy, even though there was no fire or smoke to be seen. He even had an electrician and firefighter friend come in to check it out, along with the premises owner, but there was no fault in electronics or carbon monoxide to be found. This did only happen every now and again, but he found it quite eerie that this part of the cellar bar happened to once be the orphanage basement laundry room from which the tragic fire started some 60+ years earlier. Another thing I feel I should add to this story, and something that I experienced for myself, is a known fact that echoes of screams can be heard at night from inside the apartment rooms. Remember, the upper stories of the orphanage were renovated into accommodation. A few years ago I was staying with a different friend who lived in one of the apartments, and I was sleeping on his couch during the early hours. I swear to God I started to hear faint screaming and shouting in my sleep, but I had some weird filter to it, as if the noise was coming from a TV or radio outside in the hallway. I was pretty stoned, so I opened my eyes and lay there to see if I could hear it again, but to no avail. Now, at that stage I obviously knew about the strange smoky smells from the cellar bar, but I had no idea about people hearing any screams, and so I passed no remarks on it. The next day I told my friend what I thought I heard and he confirmed it for me. He said that although he never heard any screams from his apartment, he had heard it only once from his neighbor's room, and that it seemed to be coming from either the hallway or outside in the back courtyard. Hearing this made me sad and got me thinking about the girls. I didn't mention any names of places out of respect, but details of the orphanage fire can quite easily be found on the internet, and only one of many terrible things that the Irish Catholic Church has gotten away with in the past. In 2011, my mother and father both had experiences in a hotel room with some sort of entity. My dad works in the film industry and had been staying there for about 2 weeks at this point. He works about 2 to 4 hours from home, so it's unproductive to drive every day. He had been feeling feelings of dread, hate, and misery throughout his whole stay. He's never been like that. I'm practically a photocopy of his personality, though I look just like my mum, and this is very, very abnormal behavior for him. He had been plagued with dark thoughts endlessly while he was there. His only relief was during the weekends, when he would come home to us. At some point, my mum went to visit him during the week and stayed in the hotel room with him. She slept restlessly and was uncomfortable throughout the night. He left for work at 7 a.m. and she woke up just to kiss him from bed and fell back asleep. Though she said it was strange because she didn't remember actually being asleep or awake. It was just strange idleness. At 7:30 she awoke to a feeling of supreme dread, the feeling of an evil presence. She felt someone pinning her arms to the side and pressing down on her chest, as if it were laying on top of her. She thought she was being raped, until she opened her eyes and saw that there was no one there. She could almost see something. Not physical. It was almost like something was there. People would say this is classic sleep paralysis, and I have my own thoughts about it. She called my dad in tears after that, and he told her about his experiences in the hotel. She left and occupied herself in the city. When Dad got off work, they went to the front desk to change rooms. I'm not sure if the attendant asked or if they volunteered the information, but they explained why. And they were told that they were the 5th set of guests to have moved rooms because of negative paranormal experiences. And after a little bit of back and forth, he revealed that someone had ended their life in that very room. As far as sleep paralysis goes, I believe that rather than a way to explain away and allow for dismissal of the encounter, it's actually a product of encounters. In any case, they were glad to be rid of that room, and as far as I'm aware, the rest of their stay was uneventful. When I was younger, I remember waking up to an empty house. There was a note on my TV with $100 saying they all left to LA. My parents had a computer in their room, and I would talk to my friends on MySpace and listen to music through YouTube. I was home alone for the weekend, and when I had to take a potty break, I came back and sat down. Right before I was going to click resume for the music to start playing, I swear I heard someone get right up off the bed as if they were behind me, like someone was sitting on the bed and got up and left. The only noise that you would hear is when you would sit up or stand up, kind of like the mushy sound the mattress makes. Another time I spent the night at a friend's house. His parents were very anal about having friends over. His parents had left to another state for an emergency, leaving their son home alone. Apparently he had played Ouija board with friends, and ever since the house was haunted. He had invited me and another friend over to spend the night. As everyone was asleep, I was too scared to pass out. Eventually I heard a door open upstairs and started to shove my friends awake. Nothing, they were out cold. Then I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, step by step, slower and slower. As soon as they get to the final step, my friend wakes up and there's a pause. Trevor? Who the hell is here? Oh, it's just the ghost, he'll leave us alone. After he passes out, the footsteps rush back upstairs and the door slowly closes. The next morning he shows me the Ouija board hidden in the compartment where to this day his parents never knew or found out about. I was about 4 when this happened. I had seen shadows on the wall and stuff like that. I told my parents and was met with the whole overactive imagination thing. My parents also had their instances with the paranormal, but weren't all that worried about them. That was until one calm night in the summer. My house has the front door leading to a set of stairs that takes you to the living room with the hallway attached. The hallway first has the bathroom on the right, then the baby room for my soon arriving little brother, my room at the end to the left, and my parents' room right across from it. I don't remember what time it was, other than it was past midnight on Friday, so actually really early Saturday morning, I wake up to heavy footfalls in the hallway. I mean heavy graveyard boots, and the dude who was wearing them had enough of today's type heavy gear, so after hearing this I booked it to my parents' room. I thought I would have to wake them, but the footsteps were so loud that they were also awoken by them. I jumped on their bed, immediately got under the covers and told them what happened. They were both still groggy from waking up so suddenly and didn't realize if they'd heard the footfalls or not. That was until they sounded like they were right outside my parents' bedroom door. Another thing I should mention is we always left the doors open in our rooms when there wasn't any company in the house, so we saw nothing at the door, but sure as hell heard it. My dad immediately grabbed his 9mm from under his pillow and cleared the entire house. There was nobody else but us 3. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. We couldn't explain what happened the next morning, so we went on with chores we had planned. In the hallway we have 2 small carpets. We picked them up and brought them outside since they needed a legitimate wash, not just to be vacuumed. As my dad and I were hosing the carpets down outside, my mom went back in to do vacuuming. She quickly ran back outside to grab my dad and I. When we walked back into the hallway, we were stunned. There were boot marks on the wood floor under the carpet. Keep in mind the carpets had no imprints or dirt on them. They were just old and dusty. To this day, my family can't explain what happened. We just accept that it did. We moved from a small, cozy home to a much larger, old Victorian terraced house in a busy part of the city. The house had been an old shop and had a separate new annex that had been built along the side of it. This house was perfect, as we had moved to accommodate my nan who needed care around the clock, but didn't want to move into a nursing home. The house was huge, with a long, tree-lined garden. The newer parts were light and airy, but the oldest parts of the building were, despite a lot of renovation, still quite dark and creepy. It wasn't ideal, as the area wasn't great, but my parents needed somewhere quickly, and it was the best available. Mom worked long hours in a sales job, and Dad schooled myself and my sister from home. This meant we could also help care for Nan when Mom wasn't around. The 5 or so years that we lived there were very stressful, to say the least, with money worries and health worries for our Nan, who sadly had dementia. I won't go into huge detail, but I just wanted to paint that picture for you. As mentioned before, my parents were heavily into the spiritual and supernatural, but more in an investigative way. Dad had previously worked as a medium, but had distanced himself from the scene due to not taking people seriously anymore and feeling a bit disillusioned with the whole thing. My sister, being a bit of a princess, had bagged the largest bedroom for herself when we moved. It also happened to be part of the new build. I was left with a smaller, dark room at the top of the stairs. I didn't mind much, as we previously had to share. It was just nice to have my own space. The bedrooms were connected via a long, rather narrow and gloomy landing, which had a bathroom in the middle. My sister's bedroom was right at the end, as it was above the new kitchen and annex. The whole upstairs, apart from the new end bedroom, had a really odd feel to it, like 3 cats would refuse to cross the landing, and when we got a dog, she would stand at the top of the stairs and growl, refusing to come into my bedroom. My room was typically old-fashioned, with a large bricked-up fireplace and dated floral wallpaper. The first night I slept there, I was nervous for no good reason, and didn't sleep well the whole night. I put this down to it being a new space, but honestly, the feeling never really left during my time there. This part of my life was not great. I was dealing with being a teenager and feeling lonely due to being home educated and not having any friends. There was also the stress of helping look after Nan, who needed total care. And the added bonus of being bullied by the local kids. I struggled with extreme depression and began to have really dark and negative thoughts towards myself. I'm not blaming the house for this, but it certainly seemed to amplify the atmosphere somehow. This might sound weird, but I believe that whatever was there fed off my negativity and intensified the activity. The first thing that happened was small doors opening and closing, things going missing for no reason and then turning up in random places, knockings and tappings on the wall. Dad tried not to scare us by talking about it, but he later said he always felt a pressure in that house and knew there was at least one entity there. I think the first big thing for me was seeing a large black triangle of smoke just drift across the front room one day. I had been sitting reading on the sofa when I looked up and saw this thing maybe 4 foot tall made of thick black smoke slowly hover across the room and disappear into the wall. The whole experience lasted around 20 seconds, and my brain didn't really properly process it. The shape had been a perfect triangle. No one believed me when I told them, and I can't quite explain it still. Next came large orbs of light that would zip across the room, and more often than not, seemingly go up to the stairs and disappear. This was not only seen by Mum, blamed car headlights, but we would usually have the heavy curtains drawn and no other real sources of moving light. The orbs would vary in size, more often than not being around the size of a closed fist. This was followed by tapping and knockings on the wall as they appeared and then disappeared up the staircase. Whatever was there liked to move things around. Mum and Dad had to collect ornaments, and we had a few around the TV. One being this cool little stone statue of a hooded lady with a small crystal ball in her lap. One day, Dad and I were playing computer games when the stone statue suddenly lifted, maybe 20 centimeters off the unit, and then slammed back down again with enough force to make a loud bang. That was the beginning of the more intense activity. I began to hear my name being called. This would only happen when I was downstairs in the dining room that was linked to the staircase upstairs. I would hear a voice, sometimes female, sometimes male, calling me by name, seemingly from upstairs. It freaked me out, but I didn't want to say anything to my parents as they were stressed enough at this point, without me adding disembodied voices to their list. During this time, my depression intensified, and I began harming myself and having very bleak suicidal thoughts. In the night, I would see dark shapes in my bedroom and flashing lights, but I was just too numb to care anymore. I would disregard them. I had a small cat that used to come into my bedroom, as he hated the dog, and would come in through my window on a night to get some peace. Every night at 3 a.m. without fail, he would leap from my bed and scramble to get out of the window again. I put this down as being a weird cat thing, but at 3 a.m. the atmosphere in my room would also change, becoming much darker. This would be when I saw shadows and lights. I told no one this, thinking that possibly it was all in my head. One night, Mum was out working, and I was awake, keeping an ear out just in case my Nan woke up and she needed help, as she frequently got confused and asked for a cup of tea late into the night. I suddenly heard a blast of noise, like a loud radio, and then doors slamming, followed by the sound of my sister screaming in terror. She ran into my room beside herself with fear. Once she had calmed down, she explained that her radio had suddenly turned itself on at full volume, and at the same time, all of her windows and doors had opened fully. Indeed, when I went to investigate, her windows were all open and the radio was blasting static through the speakers. She slept in with me that night and then told me the following day that she would rather sleep in her room after all than just stay in mine again. It's just creepy, she told me. All of this was weird. But then came the time that I physically saw what I think was an apparition. I haven't talked about the upstairs bathroom yet. It was seemingly normal, but definitely had the strangest vibe. I didn't even like going in there, as it felt like someone was watching. But it was the nearest bathroom to me, and the only one with a shower, so I used it reluctantly. One day I was brushing my teeth at the sink, when I looked up, and saw in the mirror behind me a woman in a white dressing gown. She was around 30, with long, blonde hair and dark circles under her eyes. She stood directly behind me and was staring at my reflection with a very blank and heavy gaze. I had never seen her before in my life. She looked completely real, but I got such a feeling of wrongness and fear that I just dropped the toothbrush and ran. Of course, no one else had been visiting, and the rest of my family were downstairs. It shook me up so much, I refused to visit that bathroom for a while and would wash my hair in the kitchen sink instead of showering. I told no one about her, but tried to draw her from memory in a sketchbook. I'm a pretty good artist, but the picture that I drew was technically flawless and not something that a 14-year-old girl should be able to produce. It scared me so much that I burnt the picture straight away and tried to forget about it. One day, during the worst bit of my depression, I was reading in the dining room. My dad had laid down the sofa. What? My dad had lied down for a bit on the sofa in the next room, and I assumed he was asleep. My parents were also super stressed at the time, and he was probably really tired or run down. After a while, he walked into the dining room and gave me a strange look. Now bear in mind that he used to work and make a living from being a medium for this next bit. He asked me who had been visiting my room in the night. Confused, I replied that no one had. He went blank for a second, kind of switched off, and then said, No, there's a woman, and you've been seeing stuff in your room. Of course I knew exactly what he meant, but not wanting my folks to know, I still denied it. He went quiet again, and then told me that someone had told him about the woman, and that I had seen her, and that I was in danger of hurting myself and that she was feeding off me. All of this hit home, and I finally broke down and explained all of it, even the self-harm and suicide attempts. It was very traumatic, and I hated upsetting my parents, but it was what needed to happen. Later, my dad went up to cleanse my room. He didn't seem satisfied afterwards, and my parents renovated the summer house in the garden to be my new bedroom. It was cold in the winter, but I instantly felt lighter and better in there. There was no longer that constant dread. Towards the end of our time there, we learnt a little about the previous owners from an old neighbor. I have no idea if any of this is true, as I never found proof, but I certainly need to include it. Apparently in the late 90s, a family had lived in the old shop. Something was wrong with the older daughter, who had mental health issues, and she sadly ended up taking her own life in the city park one night. We rented a large house. Each evening my wife and I would take our daughter upstairs for a bath and put her to bed. I stayed downstairs, spending a couple of hours on my laptop before going upstairs myself. For 3 years, nothing unusual happened. Then one November evening, when my wife and daughter had retired upstairs, and I was on the laptop, the room went icy cold, and I began to shiver. I had a sensation that someone was standing right behind me, staring straight at the back of my head. For several minutes, I struggled to turn and looked behind me, but I was paralyzed. It remained like this for a few minutes, and then the temperature suddenly returned to normal and I could move. There was nothing behind me. I didn't mention anything to my wife about my experience. The same events then occurred for the next 3 evenings. Still, I said nothing. On the 4th evening, after my wife had gone upstairs, instead of opening up my laptop, I sat on the sofa watching TV from this position. And from this position, I could view the entire living room. After a few moments, I became aware that there was a translucent figure of a young girl, aged around 6 or 7, with long blonde hair and dressed in night clothes. At first, I thought it was my daughter, but she has dark brown hair. The figure stood looking into the room for several minutes, then turned and walked down the hallway and vanished into the kitchen. The atmosphere was one of calm. I got up and followed her into the kitchen, but she had gone. I decided to go to bed, and still didn't say anything to my wife for fear of upsetting her. The next evening I was on the sofa, and once again the little girl appeared and stood silently just looking into the room. And once again she turned, walked down the hall and vanished. When I woke up the next morning, I decided I had to tell my wife, and began by saying that there was something I needed to talk to her about. Without any further prompting, she said to me, "Was it about the little girl?" Had she seen her too? Yes, often. I told her she could stay as long as she didn't cause a nuisance. I said that I thought her appearances were going to increase for some reason. My wife, who is quite religious, said she thought she would say some prayers to tell the little girl it would be okay for her to leave us. And after this, we never saw her again. There was also a strange ending to this story. About 6 months later, my work contract finished, and we were moving away from this house. I called the landlord, and he came over as we were leaving to settle up the paperwork and so forth. During our conversation with the landlord, he mentioned that we were his longest renters, and that most people left after a few months. I joked that it might be because his house was haunted, and related our story. The landlord then told us he had originally designed and built this house for his young family, but when their youngest daughter was 6, she had woken up one night and climbed over the stair railing and fallen to her death onto the stone floor below. The family was so distraught, they moved out and rented their home rather than selling it. The landlord said his wife had never set foot in the house for the next 15 years, right up until her death previous November. I reminded my wife that it was November when we first began seeing the little girl, and we now believed she had come in search of her mother. We felt that after saying prayers, we helped them to meet up and pass over to the other side. Before these events occurred to us, I was highly skeptical about the paranormal. My position was, show me proof. When my wife corroborated that I had seen and described exactly the same little girl, I was very careful not to prompt her in any way or try to influence her story. The complete similarities could not be explained by coincidence. Then when the landlord told us about his daughter, again without any hinting from us, it was yet another level of proof for me. 2 things stand out for me in this experience. One is that not only did I visually see the little girl, but I also was aware of her from some other internal sense that I'd never noticed before or experienced since. I think maybe we have a deeper unconscious feeling with which we can experience the paranormal. The second thing of interest was that despite being in the presence of an unworldly experience, it was not the slightest bit terrifying. In fact, the sense was of great calmness. I have to rethink my beliefs as a result of these experiences. I used to work at a hotel built in the 1800s. I'm a wedding florist, and we often go to the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas. And after the weddings around 1 to 2 a.m., when everyone is asleep, and it's just a skeleton crew of different companies cleaning up the hotel, some pretty creepy stuff happens. I've seen a few women-shaped shadow figures in big dresses at the edge of the front balcony. Sometimes they're sitting on it. Faucets in all the women's bathrooms will begin to run at full power, whether you're looking at them or in the stall. A buddy I have who works there says a couple of kids fell down the elevator shaft while it was being repaired, and you can hear the pair laughing randomly, sometimes in the middle of the day when everyone is bustling about. He said you start to recognize their voices and can identify them, especially if there are no kids in the area. Supposedly the shadow figures on the balcony are a few different brides who threw themselves off the edge after being left at the altar. I have no clue about the faucets, but it only happens at night times when it's quiet. I've never really got spooked. I'm good as long as they let me get on with my job and wash my hands after using the bathroom. Sometimes I wish I could just talk to them and check to see how they're doing. When I was 18, I moved away from home in California to attend college in the Seattle area. In order to make money, I took a lot of odd jobs such as landscaping, working events, and custodial work. For a few months in the winter of 2007 to 2008, I worked at a church as a custodian. This was an old church with a storied history. The carpets hadn't been updated since the 70s, as evidenced by the avocado green and galaxy gold colors, which really just looked like shades of baby poop after feeding them mashed up vegetables. In the basement they built a classroom and ran a small private school. I was the night custodian, so I cleaned the entire building from about 5 until everyone left at roughly 10. By 5:30 every day, I was the only person in the building. It didn't bother me much. I was new in the area and didn't have much of a social life, so I would just put on my headphones and work. I'd usually finish pretty quickly, and then run out the clock playing the electric drums in the sanctuary. If you're unfamiliar with the Seattle area, there are 2 words to best describe the deep winter months: wet and dark. It gets dark very early, and the rain is the type which soaks your soul. There is nothing on you that doesn't get soaked, even if you're just running outside to throw the trash away. So this particular night, I was in the basement cleaning the classrooms, as I liked to finish them first while there was still some sunlight shining through the windows, which were at ceiling level, as this was a basement. But I had a late start today, so the sun was already down and it was dark. I had forgotten my iPod this time, so I was humming and whistling and singing to reduce the very lonely feeling that would always come up with me when down there. I was vacuuming a classroom and had just turned the vacuum off when I heard what sounded like a woman singing in another classroom. There was a music teacher at the school, so I figured she was staying late in one of the classrooms I hadn't gotten to yet. When I brought the vacuum out into the hall to move to the next room, I was whistling that famous song from Disney's animated Robin Hood movie. You know the one. You're probably hearing it in your head right now. When I finished, I could distinctly hear a muffled woman's voice saying, "That's a good one." I then decided to follow and see who was eavesdropping on my whistling. When I opened the door to the classroom, from which the voice came, there was no one inside. And there was no chance they slipped out unnoticed, as it was a small hallway with about 6 classrooms, 3 on each side, and I was standing there when I heard the voice. This got me a bit freaked out, but I remembered my dad telling me on a backpacking trip once that the brain can't interpret the random sound of water in a stream, so it creates a false sense of hearing something you're familiar with, like people talking or music. He told me this on a trip when we were alone in the backcountry, and I swore I heard a mariachi band off in the distance when we were camping near a stream. This was one of those nights in Seattle where the rain was so heavy that no matter where you are inside, you can hear the water falling off the overflowing gutters on the ground. So I figured that was what happened. My brain heard the water falling and created a false sound memory to interpret the randomness of it. So, feeling a bit relieved, I continued on with my menial tasks. When I was cleaning the bathroom, I heard a very loud whistling coming from the hallway. This was unmistakable. There was no false sound memory at work this time. The hairs on my neck quickly stiffened, and I rose slowly, almost like I was paralyzed with fear. I had a co-worker who split the week work with me, so we were there together for part of one of our shifts. I figured he must have used his key to get in on his night off to prank me. I came out of the bathroom into the hallway and said, "Hey, Isaac, is that you?" And just as soon as the words left my mouth, I heard a woman's voice, clear as day, say, "It's me, silly," as if she was mere feet away. but there was no one there. I promptly noped the heck out, leaving the classrooms uncleaned and the vacuum still in the hallway. I called Isaac to make sure he wasn't somehow pranking me, and he said he was in his dorm room, and I could hear our dormmates in the background, so I knew he was telling the truth. I told him to come pick me up since I didn't have a car and a ghost was trying to murder me. He came and bought me some booze to calm my nerves, which I was thankful for. He told me I was just feeling spooked because of the nature of the building at night and being alone in it. I told him if he helped me finish cleaning tonight so that I wouldn't get fired for leaving, he could see for himself. So he worked on finishing the top floor, which took all of half hour. We drank a little more and headed down to the basement with warm bellies, ready to face the poltergeist. It was silent in there except for the rain flowing out from the gutters outside. We split up and were doing different classrooms. I purposefully sent him to the one where I heard the voice earlier, and about 30 seconds after he came flying out of the classroom saying we had to leave right now. I asked him what he heard, and he told me he felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder when he was looking at some of the children's artwork on the wall. This was enough for me. We hauled ass out of there and quit the next day. When the boss asked us why, we told him what happened. He told us he had video evidence of us drinking on the job, which we overlooked as there were a few cameras in certain areas, and that he was going to fire us anyway. I told him good luck with the ghosts and to maybe have a priest come and exorcise the place, albeit sarcastically. That was the last time I ever worked a custodial job where I had to be alone at night. I was living with a family I was close to after leaving my bad home at 18. They always joked about one specific hallway being haunted by a ghost they affectionately called Jerry. One day I had to go down the hall and felt something from behind, ran, and looked back when I got to the end of the hall and said, "Go away, Jerry." A few days later I come out of my bedroom that's at the top of a 13-step hardwood flight of stairs. I'm not wearing socks, I'm not dizzy, and I feel fine. All of a sudden something pushes my back hard, and I don't just fall down the stairs, I fly down them. Flip over the side railing, crash full force to the ground and slide on my back and hit my head on the bedroom door that's at the bottom right of the stairs. It gave me a slight concussion, and everyone in the house emerged and asked what happened, and how did it happen, because the only way I could have fallen the way I did is if I was shoved from behind, and there was no one upstairs with me at the time. I walked into my mum's bedroom when I was about 8. And when I turned to where I thought she was, there was a woman ghost dressed in 30s-ish clothes, bending over and looking at the wall, as she seemed to be putting an earring in. It was super clear, and when I gasped, she actually turned and looked at me, and then seemed as surprised as I was before vanishing. I really wondered to this day if that woman 50 years before saw a ghost girl walk in while she was putting on her earrings. My wife and I were asleep one night, and I awoke suddenly and felt like someone was at the foot of our bed. I opened my eyes and saw a woman standing there. She slowly turned towards me and stared, but not being fully awake yet, my brain couldn't fully get afraid, but was instead curious and confused as to why there was another person in the room. I sat up and slowly reached towards the woman, trying to figure out if she were real or not. When my hand reached her face, she vanished. My wife woke up at this point and asked me what I was doing. All I could say is that I thought I saw something. We both laid back down, facing each other, and closed our eyes, when not a minute later we both heard this guttural roar/growl that sounded like a mix between a lion, a bear, and a howler monkey, emanating from behind our headboard. There's nothing behind that wall since it's an outside second-story wall, and she immediately began screaming, and I searched the house from top to bottom. We never found out what made that noise, and it took us a long time before we could sleep in our bedroom again. I am from the United States, but my parents are from India, specifically the northern Indian state of Punjab. Before COVID, I would travel there frequently, as my parents wanted me and my siblings to spend time with my elderly grandparents. Punjab is, in my opinion, very beautiful. It's mostly farmlands, flat and green, so vast that it's hard to see where the farms end in certain areas, like a sea or an ocean. It's this beauty that motivates the farmer from the Punjab and other states to protest the Indian government's new agricultural laws, which will make living off agricultural work harder than it already is. But I digress. The summer of 2013, I was visiting my dad's parents. They lived by themselves in a large house which looked a bit like a castle, 3 stories high, though the top floors were pretty much abandoned, as my grandparents had a hard time with stairs. On the bottom floor were 4 bedrooms and a large storage room, which are very common in the Punjab. These are rooms that work like attics or basements, where old and extra things are kept. One unusual thing about the house, which isn't uncommon there, was windows inside it. This was to keep the house ventilated and mold out during the monsoon. The room I shared with my older brother was right next to the storage room and had 2 large windows that connected to it. My brother, who had lived in that house, said the house wasn't normal. He said that when the house was being built, some woman had done black magic on the ground where she had sacrificed a dog in a ritual, and the remains of the dog were still under the floor in the storage room. I was fully creeped out but didn't want to admit it, though I remember feeling creeped out every time I would look out at the sealed window in our shared room with the storage room. My brother and I are essentially the same personality and butt heads all the time. I forget what we were arguing about. I was so frustrated that I went to the abandoned 2nd floor and just hung out there for a while. It was dusty and grey from old cement falling here and there. Like in the movies, old furniture was covered in white and now greying cloth, making the whole floor look like a scene from Scooby-Doo. Maybe it was the story of black magic, or me being upset, but I felt like something was staring at me the whole time, like someone was standing right in front of me behind the grey dust and white cloth, but someone I couldn't see. My brain cells were telling me that someone should be there, though I couldn't see anyone. I freaked out a bit in my stubborn anger and decided to step out onto the balcony rather than go back down. It was a beautiful but stuffy afternoon, something I was enjoying until I saw little white twigs lining the balcony's rail. I looked closer to see that they weren't twigs but bones. Not human, of course, maybe bird or rat, but there were no rib cages or skulls, just arms and wings. I freaked out once again and saw ants clamoring around them. This reminded me of the story of the black magic dog ritual, and finally I broke and went back downstairs. To my chagrin, that wasn't the end of the creepy things for the night. My brother had decided to give me the room all to myself out of the same stubborn anger I had. He knew I was afraid, but I wasn't going to let him get to me like that. So when it came to sleep, I closed the lights and tried to sleep. My head was towards the window of the storage room. True darkness does not come from a lack of light, but our mindset, and I began to get creeped out while in the darkness. So I put on my phone light and scanned the whole room, but didn't see anything. I felt the same eerie feeling I had upstairs, as if I was a few feet away from intelligent eyes watching me. I decided it was nothing, placing the lit phone near my head like a nightlight. I put on some music and faded to sleep. Sometime into sleep I awoke. My eyes just flipped open and I felt terrified, like my senses were going haywire. My phone's light was moving as a dark shape seemed to run around the room. It looked like a person, with long hair running around, screaming and singing, humming a weird tune. I couldn't really catch a good view of it, as it seemed its hair was all over my face. I tried reaching for my phone. It was still lit somewhere in the room. I couldn't see where, though, only its dim light. I knew I wasn't having a night terror, as I could move my hands and arms. I just couldn't seem to find my phone. until I gathered my courage and lunged up and flicked on the light. There was nothing in the room. The room was as it was, except for my bed, where I had ripped out the bedsheet that had been tucked from the mattress. My phone was right there, near my pillow. Light still on. I don't know what it was that night, but I definitely think it was the summer heat and the negative feelings I had against my brother joining together to pick up a story and bother me. Though in recent years we have found out the land our house is built on was once a butcher shop and house. Way before, during the 1940s, when our village was an Afghan or Pathan village, they moved out during the partition, and my great-grandfather bought the land. My uncle says that there were large hooks for stringing up meat and large animals left behind. And down the street, where there are now shops, used to be a Muslim graveyard. My dad tells me he remembers the graves being dug up and moved somewhere when he was young. That street is apparently also known as a street where the witch lives, though I personally don't believe or disbelieve in these things. We also have a large metal basin which apparently was made from a downed Pakistani aircraft from one of the many wars the two nations have fought, though I doubt it has anything to do with this. I'm a 15-year-old female. 2 years ago, I was waking up to go to school one morning. My mum woke me up and then walked to the other side of my room to grab some clothes out my closet. I was tired, but I woke up pretty quick, though I didn't leave my bed since I was comfortable. I look over and then see an old man standing at the end of my bed. He was old and had a walker. Imagine one of those square ones with the tennis balls at the bottom, except it didn't have tennis balls. And then he started walking around the side of the bed towards me. I might have just been tired, but I wasn't scared at all, and I called out, "Hello?" My mum looked over and asked who I was talking to which I reply, "The old man." She gets confused, and so do I, because he's no longer there, and moments later we just stopped talking about it. The second story is by far the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. One night I was staying up super late because I had recently gotten a telescope and my dad and I were going to set it up at midnight and look at the stars. I am in the playroom watching Harry Potter with all the lights off, except for maybe the kitchen light, which was in the room next to the one I was in. The front door was open, but we had a screen door that was shut. Everything's fine until suddenly something slams into the screen door and just stands there. I stare at it, unable to move, just scared out my mind. It was dark, but there was enough light where I would have been able to see it if it were an animal or something. But it wasn't. I couldn't see anything but the bulge in the screen. I knew it was tall, probably 4 to 6 feet, and it was just standing there. I couldn't see any eyes, but I knew it was watching me. And after what felt like an eternity but was probably mere minutes, it finally backed away and presumably ran. I was frozen in fear. I ran screaming for my parents who were across the house from me. About a year or two later, I finally realized how dangerous that situation could have been, since the screen door wasn't locked. Whatever that thing was could have just come in and taken me, but it didn't. It elected to watch me and leave. This is my final story. I had just gotten out of the shower and was staring out the window in my room with my towel wrapped around me. On the other side of my room, I had a shelf thing that instead of shelves, it was just bars. I have this doll that was like a music box that I got for my first birthday, and it was on one of the shelves, when suddenly it began playing. I walked over, and when I picked it up, it just stops. But it shouldn't have been able to just play, because the wind-up thing at the bottom was stuck between 2 of the bars. It never happened again, but I avoided my room that night. I've been doing security at different places in different cities for years. Every hotel I've worked at had stories from staff about seeing ghosts or having strange things happen. The stories typically claim the ghosts are of someone who killed themselves, someone who was murdered, or a staff member that died. I typically don't believe any of the stories. I can usually tell when someone is full of it, or if they're just repeating a story they heard from someone as their own. I have purposely stayed in spots where people claim that ghosts are seen, and I've never seen or experienced anything that couldn't be explained with wind, bad lighting, or it just being a creepy spot to be in. There is one place that I worked at, however, where it genuinely was creepy, and I did experience something I absolutely cannot explain. Knowing I looked into any possible explanation and can still not come up with anything really creeps me out and has changed my mindset on ghosts or the supernatural. I always wanted to believe they were real. Now, I entirely do. It's just a matter of figuring out when people are making it up, or over-exaggerating, and when they're too blinded by fear to realize the real cause of what happened. So I used to work at a hotel in Palm Springs, California, that used to be Gene Autry's house and property. The property consisted of south and north buildings, where the guest rooms were located. There is a big spa, a ballroom, the Autry house, as well as a maintenance shed and security trailer. All buildings were tied together with landscaping and consisted of large, tall bushes and trees with dirt paths carved through them. Wandering around the paths, you would find grass areas, one with a fireplace, one with hammocks, an area for petanque, a tennis court, 2 pools, and a ping-pong table next to an outside bar. The south and north buildings had white hallways with the guest rooms painted blood red. Every time I turned a corner, I thought I was going to see the girls from The Shining. The spa was called PSYC, Palm Springs Yacht Club, and not only had a creepy name, but the decor was dated. I hated going in there. It was super dark, had all kinds of corridors, showers and dark rooms that I had to check. The ballroom was a giant open area with a kitchen attached in the back, as well as a seating area in the front. The place wasn't very scary, and it was easy to lock down. In fact, I'd take my breaks in there to make sure I wasn't being bothered by anyone. I had to go into the Autry house every night, if it was vacant, and make sure it was clean and ensure the lights were off. The house was in a C shape, with the 2 wings being connected by the main room and kitchen. At the end of each wing there was a master bedroom. In between the master bedrooms there was a patio area, with sliding glass doors to each room. There were animal skin rugs on the ground, old paintings on the walls, and the faucets in the bathrooms were figures of lion heads. The north main room, top right part of the C shape, was a wall covered in wooden African masks, some shaped like animals, some evil looking with horns. I hated it. I stopped going into either main room because my imagination would run rampant. The rooms had an intercom system on the walls, and I was terrified I'd be in one of the rooms and have the intercom go off. I often imagined that I would look across the patio to the other room and find someone in one of those masks staring at me. There was a maintenance man called Mac that worked there. He was a really cool older guy that I talked to at the time. He was a Green Beret in Vietnam, and I had a lot of respect for him. He told me old combat stories, and we'd speak about life and family. He seemed like a perfectly normal guy, but he always had stories of ghosts on the property. He didn't willingly give the information up, but if you asked, he would tentatively tell you some. The more I got to know him, the crazier his stories sounded. He told me he would see the hammocks start to swing by themselves, and when he'd be nearby changing a landscape light, he told me the tennis court lights would go on and off. He had a story of a female who he would see every once in a while in the ballroom, dancing in a red dress by herself. Another story that stood out was about a person he had seen floating across the pool in PSYC. After the last few stories, I started to really question if Mac had a few screws loose from combat, or if he just liked messing with people. I would really press him on whether the stories were true or not. He was totally adamant they were true, and eventually stopped talking about it. I learned to leave it alone. There were other stories of seeing a female in a green shirt in the bathroom mirror. Actually, one security guard quit one night. He said he came out of the bathroom and saw a woman in a green sweater staring at him next to the bed. Not saying anything, he ran out of the room and quit immediately. I know that part is true, because I had to cover his shift. One last story I remember sticking out was from a guy in room service. He told me he was delivering an order to Autry House one night. He took the path that passed the Penticott Court, and he dropped the food off and began to walk his way back. As he was passing the court, all of the chairs were lined up across the pathway, blocking him from walking past. The court has soft sand, so you can tell when someone has been walking through. He said he didn't see any footsteps. He put the chairs back and stopped walking that way. But this is now my experience. One of my duties for the night was to go into each vacant room to ensure all of the lights were off, note if the rooms were clean or dirty, and ensure the windows were locked, and make sure the air conditioner was set to 75. Sometimes you would walk into a room and the phone on the nightstand would turn its speaker on and it would start crackling. I always chalked this up to it just being an old phone and bad wiring, and I wouldn't get too scared if I told myself that while I did my job. Well, one night, I was checking the rooms in the north building on the second floor. I was going into room 46N. All of the lights were on in the room, which was typical. I started turning all of the lights off, starting from the left side, going around to the right, where I would end at the bathroom. The bathroom had 2 French-style doors that open outwards into the room. The left door was partially closed, and the bathroom light was on the other side. I opened the door outwards, all the way to the wall of the room. I reached it and turned the light off. I took a step towards the entry hallway of the room. I always kept the light on so that I could see my way out. I noticed the room was freezing. This did not seem strange to me. Sometimes housekeeping turned the air conditioning down to the 60s while they were working in there if it was hot. I reached up to the thermostat next to the bathroom. Before I could touch the thermostat, the bathroom door I had opened slammed shut so hard the walls shook. You need to understand these doors only had hinges and a simple locking device near the handle. No springs or arms attached. The doors were made of very light slated wood. If I threw the door open as hard as it could, it would not have slammed. I ran out of the room so fast. It took me only 3 or 4 giant steps, and I opened the door and ran through it into the hallway. As I was pulling the door closed, the deadbolt ejected out of the door and slammed into the door frame. I was terrified, but I wanted to close the damn door. I dreaded having to do it, so I reached in and quickly turned the switch and closed the door. I was so surprised by what happened I was tearing up. I decided I couldn't exactly chalk that event up to paranormal, unless I investigated a little bit. I went back into the room. The door was still closed. I opened it and threw it as hard as I could. The door caught so much wind it slowed down and barely got to the frame. I already knew the windows were closed and locked, so it wasn't the wind. The floor was not uneven near the door, so it wasn't being pulled in by gravity. I looked at the thermostat. It was set to 75. It was also no longer freezing cold. I got out of the room and never went back in. I never had any more experiences, though I avoid putting myself in a position of being in one. I would turn the lights off in the rooms as quickly as I could. I would look down when approaching the bathroom to ensure I didn't see anyone in a mirror, and I told my story to Mac and he wasn't surprised. He said that's just what they do when people don't believe they were there. He told me not to worry, as they were just making their presence known. Throughout my life, I've had a number of spooky experiences. The first was when I was 12. I saw an old lady in 1800s attire, blue dress, blue bonnet, knitting something while crying. I stuck my head under the covers and looked again, and suddenly she was gone. Fast forward 12 years, and I was staying at my friend's house that he had inherited from his grandparents who died inside it the year prior. This was about 5 months of sobriety for me. The first encounter in that house about the second day I was there, I was awoken by what sounded like a loud, open-handed smack on the closet door, which jolted me awake, then focused on controlling my heart rate. As cliché as it sounds, it seemed I would occasionally hear whispers, but I could never make out the words precisely. Just like in scary movies, but I always brushed it off. The second encounter inside my friend's house was when I was taking a shower with music on loud. I rinsed, turned the water off, opened the curtain, and right as I was grabbing my towel, the fire alarm went off for 10 seconds, stopped, went off again for a whole minute before stopping, and I figured it was the spirit messing with me, so I turned the music down and went about my day. The third encounter was when I was sleeping in my room. I had a pretty big pile of pocket change on my dresser at the time, and woke up to what sounded like someone running their hand through the change, making the loud pitch that US currency does. Again, I immediately started focusing on controlling my heart rate. 20 seconds later, I felt what seemed like 2 fingers run down my thigh. I tripped out so hard but eventually fell back asleep. The third encounter was when I started dating this girl that I knew I shouldn't have been, but for some reason I liked to torture myself. I was already thinking about breaking it off with her at this point. While we were laying in bed, literally, as I was thinking of breaking it off with her, I heard a whisper that I could make out the word break in it, about 6 other words long. As I was trying to form sentences around the whisper, I just heard there was a tapping at my bedroom window, 2 sets of 5 taps. After the second set, I asked her if she heard the tapping, and she said yes. Then it stopped. I broke up with her the next day. My fourth encounter. I had broken up with her the day before, while I was in my room, and I was listening to music and writing my thoughts down on a piece of paper, when I heard what sounded like an old man yell my name from out loud from the hallway. So I shouted back, "Yo!" thinking perhaps it was my friend, and got no response. My friend was smoking his bong inside his bathroom in his room, and told him what I had just heard. After I told him, I could feel what felt like electricity spiking through my brain. It just felt tingly, but it was tingling for the most part in the back, or the cerebellum. I started to trip a little, so went to sit on the front porch with my friend and came with. As we were chilling there, a 3-legged cat that would sometimes come around came directly to me, which it never did, and sat underneath a chair. It stayed under my chair until it left, which then I realized my brain was feeling normal. I moved out shortly after into an apartment by myself. I ended up getting back with the girl I was with during this, and she ended up dying in my apartment on Christmas morning. And to those of you wondering, the thing that my ex regrettably died from was an overdose. I'm still convinced it was a positive ghost that wanted to help in some way. He ended up selling the house to his cousin and cousin's wife. About a year ago, I asked if anything weird had been happening in the house, and his wife said that she had heard sounds like children's laughter, and sometimes tapping. We both agreed that it didn't feel like a negative energy. I'm convinced it's one of his grandparents, which are also my distant relatives. I want to learn more and get involved with others dealing with spiritual entities, for I feel I'm more sensitive than perhaps your average person. When I was young, about 3 or so, my great-grandmother passed away. She died in the middle of the night in her sleep, so no one in my family found out about the death until the morning. However, in the middle of the night she died, my mother came in to check up on us to make sure I was sleeping. She found me sitting in my bed staring into the corner of the room. When she asked me what was wrong, I said that there was a lady in the corner of the room. My mum told me that nothing was there, but I kept insisting there was a lady standing in the corner of my room watching me when I tried to sleep. This obviously freaked my mum out, and she kept coming in to check on me every hour or so. We found out in the morning that my great-grandmother died, and my family believes that the lady I saw standing in the corner of the room was her, saying her last goodbyes to me before she passed on. I have had to deal with shadow people for a while. My first encounter was before I was 9. My siblings and I shared a room in my 2-bedroom house. My bed was on the lower bunk, the head of which gave me a pretty good view into the hall. I wake up feeling like someone was watching me. I checked the window and kind of just mull around for a bit. I turned over it and saw in the frame of the door a dark, shadowy silhouette of a woman. I could see the hall behind it, but her colour was that of like when you've fallen asleep, turn on a light, and then turn it off. That weird, flickering collage of colour and texture. I called out, "Mum?" and I didn't get a response. After a while of just standing there watching me, it left. It didn't feel sinister or good, just creepy and out of place. The next encounter was probably around the age of 11 or 12 at my grandparents' house. I decided to stay in a room I'd never slept in before. It never felt right to me, so I kind of avoided it. The sound was different in the room, kind of made my ears feel like they were pressurized. I go to sleep and feel the same creepy, someone's watching me feeling. I check the window. I've never been afraid of the dark or frightened by things in the closet or under the bed. But that night, I was. I checked both multiple times. Finally, I tried to persuade myself to go to sleep and turned the light off. After a while, I opened my eyes and saw two large shadowy figures at the foot of my bed. They both had that same look to them as the woman before. There was definitely outlines of their silhouettes. I could clearly see the dresser opposite me and looked normal in some places, but like there was a dark veil over others. I froze. I wanted to run out the room, but I couldn't get the nerve. I was paralyzed by fear. I began praying and saying phrases that my Pentecostal grandparents told me to do, plead to the blood of Jesus, rebuke Satan, etc. But as much as I wanted to believe the protection of Jesus was upon me, I was terrified, and nothing was working. The figures began to grow, and the boundaries of the room had no effect on them. They grew as tall as trees and loomed over me. It was like the more afraid I became, the more power they had. Then, at my most terrified, it felt as though someone pours warm honey in my heart. You know those commercials that show how medicines flow through the body? It was like that. The warm and soothing feeling spread through my body, like a ripple of serenity coursed through me. And then they were gone, and I fell back asleep. The third time was the most significant event in my life. I believe I developed cancer and a rare infection as a child. I wound up in the ICU and they had to surgically remove the infection, which meant losing an eye. I was dying at 14, my body was shutting down, my urine was straight up black. I couldn't eat, I couldn't even go poop. The infection had done something to my nervous system and my legs were temporarily paralyzed. It was looking like the end. One night I was staying with my dad. I was rightfully depressed as hell and really didn't want to talk to anyone. I had spent every day pretending to be happy and holding conversations and dealing with the constant barrage of nurses and doctors every 15 to 30 minutes. I just didn't want to talk. Well, my dad was bored with me because I just wanted to have a pity party, so he got my grandma to come by with her friend. I wasn't in the mood for holy conversations about how God is good and your typical how you doing and hang in there conversations that we had anyway. They bought anointing oil and prayed with me. I closed my eye, the other being a huge infected bubble of decaying flesh at the time, and saw the outline of my room's door. I thought it was strange. Typically, burn-in images kind of drift around that aren't as defined as this, and I tried to wash the image away by moving my eye around, but it stayed where it was. Then the door opened. It didn't open much, just wide enough for the silhouette of a head to pop in. I sat there, shocked in horror and confusion and amazement, that I was watching a shadow person walk through a door in my head. I thought it was death. It was a clear outline of a man, and I watched it walk up to the foot of the bed. I was praying not to die, for forgiveness for the myriad of sins I committed. It reached out its hand towards my face. It stretched from the foot of my hospital bed and touched my forehead, at the exact same time my grandma anointed my head with oil. I was freaked out. I didn't know what it meant. Was that it? Was I going to live or die? The prayer is wrapped up, and that night I prayed to God to tell me what it meant. I know it's not okay to ask God for validation of what just happened, but I was 13. Surely I could get a little leeway. I woke up the next morning knowing I wasn't going to die. It was as factual to me as if it had already happened. The family was stoked as well as I, but we didn't know that my life would ever be the same. I would always be disabled and never be able to hide it. The last time I saw them was the day of the surgery to remove the eye. Everyone was on edge. You could feel the adrenaline in the air. Nurses and doctors stream in and out of the room as they prep me for surgery. My family comes to say they love me one last time before I get taken into surgery, and possible death, as it was a pretty vicious infection, and they had to scrape my front brain lobe due to the infection beginning to attack it. It was do or die. I, on the other hand, already knew what would happen. I was going to survive. They gave me some relaxing medication as they unhooked me from my monitors, and I was kind of kicked back and cruising. I began to see shadow people all around my bed, 3 or 4 on each side. They were not like the ones I saw at my grandparents' house. They were good. I tried to speak to them a few times, but they didn't respond. I thought it was hilarious that people were walking through them and didn't even realize it. I noticed a white light in the corner of my eye as well. It was like looking at a dimly lit star. You can't really see it when you look directly at it, but if you look to the side of it, you can make it out a bit. It was like the inverse of a shadow person, a light person, sitting in the chair my parents used when they stayed with me. I don't know if it was him or not, but it was comforting to see. A few years ago, I was driving down to Florida from Virginia. It certainly was time-consuming, but I was willing to take the time out of my week to see family. On my way there, I had to stop by a hotel to spend the night. I can't recall the name, but I know it was in Georgia. I had actually decided to spend a few nights there, since I had plenty of time to see my family, and I was sore from driving for hours. I checked in at the front desk and got room 465. Why I remembered this and not the hotel name, I will never know, but I rented the room for 3 to 4 days, just enough time to relax and enjoy the nice weather, maybe even go for a swim. It's going to be perfect, I thought, but I was wrong. My first night was alright. The entire day was normal as always, although it was really hard to sleep. I tried to go to sleep around 10ish, but I didn't manage until about 3 a.m. The hotel must have been old, because throughout the night I kept hearing creaking noises. Not just that, but the people above me must have been energetic, because I kept hearing their loud footsteps throughout the night. I don't remember how I went even 5 minutes without opening my eyes, but I did and I fell asleep. I was wondering if I should make a complaint about the noise, but figured it would be best not to, since it was my only and first night there. When I woke up, the room was a bit messier than I remembered it, but I was tired. Maybe I imagined it. I got out of bed and walked over to the bathroom to get my morning shower. I turned the water on to the perfect temperature, stripped out of my clothes and hopped in. I made sure the bathroom door was locked because I'm paranoid about these things. In case you've never been in a hotel, the doors are inaccessible to anyone that doesn't have the card, except, of course, service employees and such. I hadn't been in my shower long when I heard my hotel door open. This kind of freaked me out, but I assumed it was just the maid. "Hello?" I called out from the shower. I wait a moment only to realize nothing, but silence was greeting me. I open my shower curtain and look out into the bathroom, but I was completely alone, and it was empty, except for my clothes lying down. So I closed the shower curtain and decided to ignore the noise. As I start rubbing the shampoo into my head, I heard a small, faint click. The same click you hear when a door is being unlocked. The exact same click that I heard when I pushed in the lock for my bathroom door. My heart jumped, and before I knew it, I was shaking horribly. I heard the bathroom door slowly creak open, and before I knew what I was doing, I threw the shower curtain open. The bathroom door was wide open. I looked around the bathroom, but there wasn't the sign of anyone, not a single trace other than the door wide open. I immediately shut the shower off and ran out of the bathroom and into the bedroom, putting my clothes on as quickly as possible and running out into the hallway. I leaned up against the wall, sliding down it into a sitting position. I ended up walking down to the front desk and requesting another key for my room, due to the fact I never picked one up on my way out. After giving them some identification, they gave me a new key card, and I brought it back up to my room. I had to slide it about 4 times before it decided to unlock. When I opened it, the room was trashed. I couldn't make sense of it. It was like someone had recently been in my room and destroyed it while I had been gone. I don't know how anyone could have gotten in, and that concerned me. But I still had to stay one last night in the hotel, so that's what I did. After cleaning up the room, I checked every door in the hotel, making sure they were all locked. They were. I hopped into my bed, tucked myself in, and drifted off to sleep. I woke up looking at the clock. 4 a.m. I sat up in bed, about to place my feet on the ground when I heard something. The hotel door slowly creaked open. Chill shot down my spine faster than ever. I slowly shifted my head to look at the door as it opened, revealing the silhouette of a woman with dirty, long black hair, dressed in a short, torn-up, bloody gown. She began walking towards me. She walked as if in stop motion, bones snapping every time she moved forward. I wanted to scream for help, but I couldn't. Then I heard down the hall a couple walking together and laughing. Her head turned slowly. She heard it too. She made stop-motion steps towards the wall, making me gag from the sound. She climbed up onto the wall and crawled out of the hallway. I turned on the lights, packed everything I could, and ran out of the hotel as fast as possible. To this day, I've never seen her again. I think the hotel may have been shut down shortly after, but I don't know for a fact. I will remember how she walked, the most frightening thing I've seen in my life. On the way to Florida from the hotel, I realized something. I realized something that has been burned into my mind ever since. That day I was taking a shower and the door opened. When I looked all around my bathroom to find no traces from anyone, I never once looked at the ceiling. I studied and lived in Edinburgh, and the apartment I lived in was very old. It had old, worn-down concrete steps, which spiraled around to each landing, and the only light came from a skylight 3 floors up. In the winter months, it was pitch black in this hallway. On one winter's night, I was returning from the local Tesco, and I was fumbling along the walls around the stairwell because it was pitch black. I lived on the 3rd floor, so it was an absolute pain in the arse and took ages. When something brushed past me, there was no sound at all, but I felt it. I never believed in ghosts before, but I couldn't explain this. Something definitely brushed past me and set me off balance. It completely freaked me out. Anyway, I made it to my flat eventually, and all was well, and I quickly forgot about the whole incident. 1 month later, I leave Edinburgh. I switch on the news one evening while eating my dinner, and had the biggest shock of my life. There was a dead body found in the flat directly opposite mine. Same hallway, 3 feet. Now you're probably thinking, no big deal, yeah? Dead bodies are found all the time. Well, that body lay in that flat for 5 years. The whole duration I lived there. Here's the really messed up part of the story. I lived in a different flat in Edinburgh before this all happened. I used to receive mail from the previous owners and landlord. Guess who the letters were addressed to? Yep, the name of the person found dead. I'll never forget the name for the rest of my life. Rest in peace, Isabella Purves. My husband does not believe in the paranormal. Me, on the other hand, does, to the point of knocking on walls to get the ghosts to come out and play. One evening I went out quickly to pick up some dinner for me and my husband before a friend came over. While I was at the place and ordering, they didn't have what he wanted, so I called him. He answered the phone and sounded off. He asked me to come home quick because something happened. I go into panic mode and I could hear the distress in his voice. After some badgering, I made him tell me what happened. I have a little shadow box with a small porcelain bisque doll mounted in it called Frozen Charlotte. There is a creepy story behind the dolls, and I bought it for the creep factor. I firmly believe the doll and shadow box are not haunted. Apparently, as my husband was chilling in the living room waiting for me, the shadow box launched at him from the small hallway and the way where it was hung into the living room where he was sitting. It was a very far distance for it to travel. He got really spooked and went outside to have a cigarette when I called. I was a little creeped out but more curious and envious that he got to have the ghost throw something at his head and I didn't. I got our food and headed home. While I was on my way home, he was outside and our friend showed up. They both go into the house to see the kitchen was an absolute disaster. Every drawer was open, cabinets, and the trash that sits in front of one drawer was tipped over. The drawer in question is where I keep kitchen linens. It was open with all the towels, tablecloths, and placement mats strewn over the place. My husband said to our friend, "It wasn't like this earlier." So I come home and my friend is standing on our back stoop and is like, "Come inside and see." I was pretty shocked. The place was pretty messy, as my husband was freaked out. I put the food down and started cleaning, put the towels back into the bottom drawer and shoved the drawer closed. The drawer is super old and isn't on runners or anything, it won't close. I sigh and heave the thing out because I thought a towel or something got trapped behind it. I was right, but it wasn't a towel. It was a small plastic baggie, and inside it had a bit of paper and a string tied around it. I'd never seen this thing before, and was no idea what it was. So I open the baggie and untie the teeny tiny package and find some herbs. My friend almost gleefully says, "That is weed," and true enough I took a whiff and it was. The paper looked like a tea bag, as the string the whole thing package was wrapped up in, and it looked like a tea bag string. The amount of weed could have covered a nickel, so it wasn't much. We don't usually keep weed in the house, and if we do, it's usually in a joint. The conclusion I have is that this ghost was looking for the weed, because there's no other explanation for me. I don't believe my husband would stage this, as you can't fake his reaction. He was pale as a ghost and shaking terribly. Plus, as he was hanging up on the phone, my friend was coming up the driveway and saw him. I doubt there would have been enough time to stage the scene, as it were. We haven't had any other things happen like that, with the exception of the ghost that lives in the bathroom. But that is a story for another day. This took place about 9 years ago in a little town called Parkdale, Oregon. At the time I lived in an 100-year-old cottage with gardens in the middle of town, a population of roughly 50 people. The house was a classic red gingerbread house with a massive view of Mount Hood and really cool gardens. The bathrooms had an enormous clawfoot tub and had been a mortuary tub, really long to accommodate stiff dead bodies. My grandmother loved soaking in the tub. We co-rented the place with a mentally unstable person. We knew they were unstable, but we didn't know they were dark, who probably brought the toxic spirits into the house with them, because they have had a lot of bad luck in their family, including their dad jumping out of a window because he believed he was being chased by witches, and the sudden death of their brother and so on. But here's the story. I was sleeping in my bed, and at around 3 a.m. I was awoken by a glowing light. I opened my eyes, turned my head, and there in the middle of the room was a little man about 3 feet tall wearing a little jumpsuit. Description? blue suit with white stripes. He was also wearing a pair of black dress shoes. His hat was like Loki's helmet from Marvel, but instead of gold it was orange, with white polka dots and connected at the chin. His face held an ear-to-ear smile, and his eyes were tiny, black dots. I sat on my bed completely petrified, staring at this thing that, might I add, had no nose. He stood there staring at my mum. I called out to her, who said, "Oh my God," in her sleep. After a while, I finally returned to slumber. The next morning I told my mum about it, who didn't believe me. My grandmother did, and she had drawn him several times. She loved the experience and had me retell it countless times. She also constantly lost her car keys, sunglasses, and had her wallet hidden multiple times by the entity in the house every time she'd come to visit me. We would go and look for the items, turn the whole house upside down. She would get really snippety, and then out of nowhere the items would appear on the high counter where she'd left them originally, which was very far from my grasp. We credited the cowboy, because I saw him in the laundry room, and he was a shadow man type thing with a cowboy hat and a big pair of boots. He was just on the wall, was very tall, and then he slid down the wall into the floor and was gone. What's really creepy is that after we left the cottage and moved closer to the city of Hood River, we randomly ran into an acquaintance who said they were now renting our old place, that they loved the cottage and gardens. So we asked them how they were enjoying it, and they said that it was haunted, and that they were in the laundry room filling up the dryer when they turned around to see a full-blown apparition standing there, a cowboy, vest, jeans, boots, and a hat. Me, my mum, and my grandmother all have also had tons of experiences, but that one was the scariest by far. I worked in a hotel from 2009 to 2012. The hotel is in Regina, Saskatchewan, but because it is still functioning, I can't disclose its name. I also wanted to let you know that I have seen spirits since I was very young, so I saw plenty before this, and have seen much more since. But here are a few of my favorite stories from while working there. One of the first spirits I saw was on the grand staircase. The hotel was bustling with activity, and I was heading upstairs to one of our banquet rooms. Coming down the stairs was the banquet manager called Marge. To an 18-year-old me, a very handsome blonde man in his 20s said hi, and I blushed and stammered a hi back. Marge had responded to my greeting, and the person looked to the right and looked to be revealing half of the face to be missing, torn to shreds, and then vanished. Marge must have seen the colour drain from my face, because she asked if I was okay, and then sent me on my way. I can still picture him as clear as day. Every haunted hotel seems to have that one room that gives everyone the total creeps. Ours was on the 11th floor, and it was unanimous among the staff that no one wanted to deliver room service there or clean it. One morning I was collecting trays from outside of the rooms on the 11th floor. Suddenly that whole hallway got really cold, and I could hear scratching coming from one of the doors. I tried to find the source of the sound, and of course it was that room. As I got closer to the door, the scratching got louder, until something banged on the door and everything fell silent. I obviously ran for it. I checked with the front desk, and of course, no one was checked into that room. And for the grand finale, I had worked really late cleaning up from a wedding. I was by myself, and two of the kitchen guys, called Todd and Alex, offered to give us a lift home. We had been hearing weird noises all night, but had mostly brushed it off, and I would tell Alex was starting to get nervous. Todd had just finished locking up the last door in the hallway that contained the walk-in fridge, freezer, dry storage, etc., then flicked off the lights. We were all gathering our stuff to leave when we heard a door slam in the darkness. Alex bolted, and Todd and I both looked at each other confused. We turned the lights back on and headed down the hallway to make sure no one was back there and messing with us. We were halfway down when, I crap you not, every single locked door opened, paused, and slammed shut. Todd ran for it, but me in my dumbfound state pulled on the nearest door, and the damn thing was locked. I hightailed it out of there, jumped in Todd's truck, and we never spoke of it again. I had a black cat called Casper. We adopted her after she ran away from the previous owners. She was missing for days before the previous owners found her in the bushes, skittish and frightened. After carrying her home, the owners discovered she was allergic to cats, when her arm broke out with rashes. The call for a new home came and was answered by my animal-loving family. For ages, she was too scared to come near anyone, totally adverse to being petted. Eventually, she turned into a total sook, never missing the chance to jump on you and lie with you. We loved her, and I loved her heaps. You could feel genuine affection out of that one. Then one day, she lost the use of her back legs. Not long after she passed away. I was having a rough time then, and she was a big comforter. Point is, me and my parents were sad. A few days after, I'm sitting on my front steps having a smoke, and I hear a meowing sound identical to Casper. I look out front, and there at the gate was a cat meowing at me that looked just like her. I went over and it ran away. I looked down the street, and it was gone. I mentioned it to my parents, and they both said they had the same thing happen to each of them separately, which was a surprise to them too. Now, it could have just been a coincidentally similar cat from the neighborhood, but it only happened once to each of us, and then it was never seen again. Plenty of room for more rational explanations, but I choose to think that Casper says thanks before snuggling onto that big belly in the sky. My uncle took his own life before I was born. It was extremely hard on my mum, and for a long time she locked all photos of him away and never spoke about him. My little brother would talk about a man that visited him at night. This started pretty much as soon as he could talk coherently. Apparently the man would come and talk to him, then hold him, until he fell asleep. My little brother loved this guy, but my mum wasn't a big fan and found it really creepy, and yes, she made sure there wasn't some guy sneaking into my brother's room at night. When my brother was about 7, we were looking at a photo album at my grandma's. My brother points to a photo and says, "That's the man, the one who visits me late at night." It was our late uncle. Kind of related. The uncle and my mum had a lot of paranormal experiences and a lot of prophetic dreams. My mum still doesn't talk about him much, but she told me that once that uncle dreamt of me and my brother long before either of us had been conceived and before my parents had met. He described us perfectly to my mum. Everything he said was true. Mum also saved a life once thanks to a prophetic dream. I also have a weird paranormal man that visited me at night, but it was certainly not my uncle, nor a benevolent entity. But that is a story for another time. There's one event that has always messed with me, and probably will until the day I die. I rented a room in a house that my friend had recently purchased after my mum moved in with a boyfriend, and I didn't want to live with him because he's a jackass. It was a decent little 2-bedroom, one on each side of the house. I had only been living there for a month or two and everything had been pretty chill. My father had died around January of that year, and my mum didn't want to keep his urn in her house or put it in storage. A little backstory. My dad was a bastard. I never really had a relationship with him and hadn't seen or heard from him during the last 6 years of his life until the cops knocked on the door in the middle of the night and told me he had overdosed. I was not surprised, and neither was anyone else. We all saw it coming. So we got him cremated and debated back and forth what to do with him, and nothing ever came of it. So anyway, I'm moving in, and I felt kind of guilty putting the urn in storage, so I just stuck it in the closet. Now onto the spooky stuff. I wake up in the middle of the night, which happens frequently, and have never really been a great sleeper, so this is nothing unusual. I'm sweating balls for no reason, and I check the clock. It's about 3:58 or so, and I'm thinking, damn, I'm never going to get back to sleep, and I'm a little pissed. So I'm just sitting there thinking what I should do for a minute when I hear a noise. It sounds like someone was trying the doorknob, but I know the door isn't locked. I trust my roommate completely, and I've never had any reason to lock my door besides. It's his house. So I call out, "Nick, you awake, dude?" and get no response. I notice the noise has stopped. I'm a little weirded out, but I do not leave the bed, just lay back down and try to sleep. As I'm laying there, I notice my closet door is open, and I was looking directly at my father's urn. I felt like I was being stared at or something, but I try not to think about it. I eventually fall asleep and get up around 10 a.m. As I come out of the room and into the kitchen, I see my roommate sitting on the couch, holding a gigantic kitchen knife, and he looks absolutely terrified. He looks at me like the devil himself just walked out of my room. He literally jumps off the couch and screams, "What's wrong with you? Are you trying to kill me? That was not funny." I'm all sorts of confused and trying to figure out what the hell he's talking about. Then he lays it on me. This is his account of what he heard the previous night. He wakes up at 4 a.m. to a blood-curdling scream, obviously craps himself and jumps out of bed terrified. Then silence. He creeps into the kitchen, down the hall from my room, and calls my name. "You right?" Nothing for a few seconds. Then another scream. He said it sounded like I was being murdered, grabs the kitchen knife and rungs at my door and bangs on it a few times. There is no response, so he tries the door. It's locked. Bangs on it again. Then there's a weird shuffling noise as if someone is dragging their feet across the hardwood floor. Sounds like someone straight up walked up to the door but didn't open it. He freaks out and doesn't know what to do. He just stands away from the door for a while, ready to stab. After a few minutes of this, he just backs away, staring at the door, and stays awake until daylight. So we collectively crap ourselves, as I turn white as we look at each other, when it dawns on us. We had both been awake at the same time, 4 a.m. Both of us called out each other's names and got no response. I didn't hear him, he didn't hear me. We couldn't hear each other through a crappy hollow wooden door. If someone was banging on my door, I would have been up in half a second. It was impossible for me to sleep through something like that. I heard no screams. It was possible that I was having a nightmare or something and screamed when I awoke, but there wasn't just one, there was two. I didn't hear either. The door was apparently locked, but it wasn't when I awoke. Why didn't he call the police? I'll never know. His family is Greek and very superstitious, so he had the local priest or whatever they call them bless the house. I'm not much of a believer in ghosts and stuff, but after a while I put the old man's ashes into storage, and nothing weird has happened before or since. We never found an explanation for this, other than maybe my dad's ghost came back to scare me. My old house in New Brunswick, New Jersey was haunted by the spirit of an old Italian woman. According to my mum, she was making Italian food. I don't remember what, but it was a complicated recipe she'd never made before, and she heard an elderly female voice with an Italian accent call from the master bedroom to use condensed milk instead of low-fat milk for the sauce. From that point on, no one in the house made Italian food that was less than excellent. I once saw a ghost, a woman pushing a baby in a stroller. I didn't look at it for long, as I'd been previously told not to stare at ghosts and to not disturb them, so I did just that. Years later, I was amongst a gathering where we were exchanging ghost stories. One of my friends shared his story of a relative who had shared a story with him. To my surprise, his relative saw exactly what I had seen in the same vicinity, to where I had seen the same ghost. I couldn't believe it. Once when I was at my grandma's house, the kitchen door that had been deadbolted flew open. My grandma said, "Give Uncle George the chair and get him a beer." No one was there, but whenever the door would fly open, we learned to say hi to Uncle George and provide a beer and a chair. He was the former owner of the house and not an actual relative. He liked to visit when there was a lot of people and fun, and playing cards. I was out back at my friend's having a few beers, and I went inside to use his bathroom. I am sober at this point. Well, I turned the corner to the hallway to his bathroom, and there stood an older woman in all white with a walker, like the stereotypical ghost pale white. We made eye contact, and the reptile part of my brain just went, "Oh hey, his grandma's here. We should leave her B&P outside." Meanwhile, all I said to her was, "Sorry," and went back outside. Now me being the naive 18-year-old I was, I just assumed she came over for the night, and we didn't notice. No big deal, right? Wrong. I had met his grandma previously, and she had passed about a year prior to the gathering. It clicked the next day when I asked him how she got in without us noticing, and then he told me that she'd passed away, and that they've occasionally heard her walker scrape on the kitchen floor at night. Now, I didn't feel threatened or anything like that. It was more of a, "Gotta get back outside and pee, you dumbass." She was a sweet lady as far as I could remember. My wife has claimed to see several ghosts in our apartment. I don't know if it's real because she typically sees them in the middle of the night when she wakes up, so I personally think it could be dreams, but she swears up and down that it's not. She says that she pinches herself in everything to make sure it's not a dream, and that our dog sees them too. Once about a month ago, she said she woke up and saw the ghost of a woman standing over me while I was sleeping. She again said that she was sure she was awake and not imagining things, but she said that she sensed that the ghost meant no harm, so she rolled over and went back to sleep. It would also make sense because occasionally our dog would look at things that we couldn't see, and certain objects would get moved in our apartment when we weren't there and didn't touch them. Of course, there could be other explanations, but overall my wife is fairly convinced our apartment is haunted, and while I am suspicious, to say the least, I am slightly inclined to believe her. Since then, my wife has gotten into a lot of mysticism/pagan stuff, and has put a protection ward around our apartment. Since she has begun to do that, the paranormal stuff has not been occurring. I don't know what to think of it myself, but I thought you guys might appreciate knowing. In 2009, my cousin died. I remember that night like a movie scene. I woke up at 3 a.m. because I heard my father crying desperately. Some relatives told him about my cousin's death after falling from an apartment after a drink party. I didn't know how to react that night. We were just sad about it. The next day my father had to travel to another city for work, so in the night, me and my two brothers were sleeping together in my father's room. The interesting thing is that we were all pretending to sleep that night. Suddenly I hear some footsteps near the room. The door was closed. Me being the youngest brother, just hugged my big bro because I was so afraid. That's when I realized he heard it too. He said, "Did you hear that?" I couldn't say anything, I just stayed quiet. And then the freaking door opens by itself, but in a really gentle way, like a person did it, and see nothing but dark. In that moment, my big brother of 15 stands up and looks for a knife or something in that room. We were scared because we thought it was a robber, but we didn't find any. There were no more noises and all the other doors were closed. We still remember that night, and think it was our cousin visiting us, one final goodbye. Just the way the door opened was so unnatural. My mum had to put her dog down of 16 years a few years ago. They were absolutely inseparable. They went everywhere together and relied on each other through tough times. It was really hard on my mum, so I came down to visit her and spent some time with her over a few days. My mum was at work until 10 p.m. that night, and I left the house to go pick up something and eat for dinner. I came back in the house at around 8 and step into the kitchen. I flick the light on over the sink and start washing some dirty dishes before my mum comes home. All the other lights in the house were off, but we always kept our house locked up as well. As I'm washing dishes, I hear a dog whimper clear as day. I even think to myself, oh, maybe he's hungry or wet. The last year of his life, her dog's health had deteriorated to where he was basically bound in his doggy bed and had to be fed soft food by hand. He was also incontinent and had to be cleaned up regularly, and I tell myself I should go check on him. And that's when it dawns on me that he's dead. I turn off the tap and look back to the living room, and again I just hear it, like he used to, but this time it was softer. I turn on all the lights and look around the house for the source of the sound but find nothing. The next day, I hear the sound of his dog nails clicking on the hard wood. There's no dog in the house. At this point, I'm in a high state of denial. I can't tell my mum about what I'm experiencing because I don't want her falling into a weeping mess. She's experienced a lot of guilt and sadness about having to put him down. So the last night I was there, we were in her bedroom talking. She turns out the light to say she's going to sleep, and I'm lying on the bed and put my head down and tell her I'll go to the sofa in a sec. There's a lull in the conversation for a few seconds, and then a whimper as clear as day. She shoots up in bed and turns on the light and says, "Did you hear that?" and looks as though she's on the verge of tears. I sit up and say, "Yes, sorry, I yawned." I get up and leave. I don't especially believe in ghosts, but this is a situation I cannot explain. This happened around 4 years ago when I was living in Oregon. I had just accepted a job at a hotel as a sous chef. The hotel had just recently been built, and for whatever reason the walk-in freezer was the last part of the kitchen to be completed. Several different contractors would start the work on it, only to quickly stop, not wanting to spend a lot of time in there. They didn't even want to be around the restaurant area in general. Nobody was really sure, not really sure why the people that hired the contractors didn't really implore further, and the contractors didn't really explain why. Anybody who wasn't a guest or employee seemed to act skittish or anxious while there. Fast forward a month or two, and the freezer was finally all built and operable. Good timing, because we were to cater the services for a couple of the contractors who had finished up work on our freezer. The man and woman died shortly after finishing. I think it was under strange circumstances, like carbon monoxide poisoning in the garage or something. Anyway, back to the weird thing with our freezer. It was around March when this happened. A young girl was just hired to help in the kitchen. She was working towards being a pastry chef for the restaurant, but first she had to just get her foot in the door. I liked her. She was really serious in the kitchen, but she was really cool elsewhere. It was good to be able to switch like that. One night we had somewhat of a rush before closing. If I remember correctly, we closed at around 9 or 10, and I had to relocate to the bakery/dessert section for the remainder of the night, since dinner wasn't being served anymore. And I had invited her to join me, so she could learn a little, and I could assess her skills. We were the only employees still there that night. Slow night, so I let a couple of people go home. We had to make about 20 mousse desserts, and then we were done for the night. I showed her how to make them, watched her make a few, and then we went to the dining room to talk to a few customers. I returned maybe 15 minutes later and all the desserts were made, and they looked rather good. She was nowhere to be seen, so I took the desserts out to the customers and promptly returned to shut down the kitchen for the night. About 10 minutes later, I was basically done in the kitchen, and I just had to check the temperature of the refrigerator and freezer. I hadn't seen my employee in this time, but didn't think much of it. I found her on the freezer. She was on the floor under the bottom rack in the fetal position. Something made me not even call her name or really investigate. I just quickly tried to pull her out from under there. Her body was already ice cold and blue. She'd been in there for hours, or days, even though the last I saw her was half an hour prior. She had undoubtedly already passed. I called 911, told them everything, and had to go to the main office to check security tapes. They also spoke to some of the customers, as I was obviously suspect, since we were the only 2 employees there. Upon investigating the tapes, they decided she had just quickly entered the freezer and laid down on the floor on her own. The officers seemed to want to get the case taken care of as quickly as possible and leave. EMTs noted that it seemed she'd been in there for at least 2 days. Her internal body temperature was very low, and her eyes had basically frosted over or something. I don't remember how they determined her time of death, but it was really rushed, and they quickly determined it as suicide. I don't think there was an autopsy for some reason. Not many people were notified of the death, and after the restaurant had been closed for a few days, it opened again as if nothing had happened. I still think of her sometimes, and wonder what exactly did occur. I'd like to say that's the only strange experiences that I've had at the hotel, but there is more. A couple traveling with their son made the reservation to stay at the hotel one night. The dad said that they'd stopped in that town because it was halfway through their trip, and they were very drawn to the hotel. They arrive and shortly after head to the restaurant. The dining room was pretty full that night, as it was the weekend and the restaurant was open to the public. Family is serviced, stays for about an hour and begins to leave. The kid then isn't there anymore. Both parents claim it was really confusing and freakish because in the span of just a few minutes, having their plates cleaned and the bill paid, he silently slipped out and neither parent noticed. I felt sorry for the parents. They seemed genuinely confused, but kids wander off all the time, no big deal. The waitstaff and other staff were approached by the not yet frantic parents, but no one had been able to recall see a young boy walking around on his own. The dad was escorted to security to see if they could help find the kid. The mum stayed in the restaurant in case he returned and remained nearby so that he could find his way back. I remember this part particularly well because the guy working security cameras seemed really weirded out, and we would talk about it pretty often. He had a stroke about a year later, which was a shame because he was one of the smartest guys there and he knew a lot about the weird stuff that happened. So he was reviewing the security tapes with the dad. The view of the family in the dining room wasn't the best, but you could see them. In the time the couple said their son disappeared, they were seen talking to him as he slowly inched off the booth. It looked both natural and weird, like when a kid doesn't want to go somewhere alone or something. The dad insisted neither him or his wife remembered it happening like that. They had both been talking to him at the time. Had he slipped their minds, perhaps? In their initial story, they said they'd both been talking to him, and they were focused on paying and wrapping up and whatnot. In the tapes, they were talking to him and watching him leave. According to the tapes, about 2 minutes after him leaving, they started to look around. It's as if the past few minutes hadn't happened, or they'd just forgotten and noticed something was off. Weird differences in their memory versus the record. Most people get to the hotel by crossing a bridge. It's a really beautiful but slight bridge. I love crossing it. It's about a 10-minute walk from the hotel. Anyway, about an hour and a half goes by after the kid goes missing, and an older couple were crossing the bridge. On the furthest side from the hotel, they saw what they thought was an animal stuck between posts under the railings. They discovered it was the boy. He was deceased. He wasn't seen by any person or camera between walking away from his parents and being found. 911 was called. He was clinging to the post under the railing, like he was trying to crawl to the other side, only using his arms to pull himself along. When CPR was started, a significant amount of water was released from his lungs, and his official cause of death was drowning, even though the body was dry, and he was found on the bridge, not in the water below. No theories have been presented as to how he could have drowned in the water below, pulled himself up across the bridge, and dried off in that time. Both parents go to their room early in the morning to collect their things and get a little bit of rest. They were offered almost a full week's free stay so that they could get everything figured out. Security guy goes to check in on them and find their room devoid of any sign of their stay. They were gone without a trace, not seen by anyone. The employees are now the only people that seem to remember the incident, since the police basically let it slide and forget. Nobody at the local station will admit to it happening. It's almost as if it never happened. It's definitely one of the more chilling things that happened to me while I was there. I hope you all have happier hotel stays wherever you go. I live in a very rural area, The neighbors to my right are a quarter of a mile away and are Mennonite. There are tons of farmland and hills between them and me. The neighbors across from me are older, quiet, and go to bed at about 7 p.m. And the neighbors to my left move out this weekend. I live in a house on a little under an acre of property. Our houses are pretty spaced out along the back road we live on, not a development, and we don't get many cars through here, mostly horse and buggies. The corn is high right now, so it dampens noise from other houses, but it's generally quiet around here. I have 2 kids of 2 and 9 weeks old, and their father lives in the house too. My 2-year-old has the first bedroom. My bedroom is next to hers, and the 9-week-old sleeps in my room. And their dad has the master bedroom across from my room. The 2-year-old's door is always shut when she's sleeping, but the rest of us keep our doors open at night. I've always had anxiety about people breaking into my house, which has never happened to me before, but too many scary movies and TV shows growing up will do that to you. I notice every noise at night. I have a direct view to the master bedroom from my room, and it's very obvious when he gets up to leave his room. At night when everyone is settled in, I've been hearing noises in the walk-in basement, to the point where I have scurried from the living room to the master bedroom to ask their dad to check out the basement. When he goes down and checks, he doesn't ever see anything, but he always checks for peace of mind. Last night, I had probably the most heart-racing, body-shaking, in-fear experience. It was about 3 a.m, and I heard a car door shut outside, which is totally out of the norm, but I was like, okay, take a breath. I'm sure the neighbors just needed to get something from the car. So about 5 minutes later, I got up and peeked out the windows in my room, and I didn't see anyone or anything. I also would be able to see headlights shining through if a car was turned on at my neighbors driving down the road or in my driveway. And about 5 minutes after that, I heard noises coming from either the master bedroom or the basement, presumably the kid's father doing something. I got up and peeked into the master bedroom, and he was laying on the futon asleep. So I creeped down the hallway to the bathroom and peeked in to see if my 2-year-old had maybe wandered out of her room, but she hadn't. So I went back and sat on my bed. Then another 5 minutes go by, and I hear clattering in the sink, like metal on metal clattering. Sounded like someone was dropping utensils into it. So I jumped up, and my heart started pounding. I was watching the walls to see if I saw any shadows. I finally got the courage to scurry across the hall and woke up my kid's father. I told him what I'd heard, so he stumbled into the kitchen, me about 2 feet behind him. No one was there. So I went to examine the sink, and a dirty fork was sitting in it. I had just done the dishes after dessert, so the sink should have been empty, and I was the last person out the kitchen. I walked over to the basement door and saw it was cracked. I knew I shut it when I came up from doing laundry, so I asked the kid's father if he had left the door to the basement open. He said, yeah, I probably did that when I came back up. I'm pretty sure he was bluffing, because I don't think he went into the basement yesterday at all. So he moved our heavy iron-made kitchen chairs in front of the basement door and locked it. So then I checked out the rest of the house, the closets, pantries, bathrooms, and decided it must be in my head. So I sat back down in my room. Then I heard more noises. I heard footsteps coming up and down the basement. Then everything went quiet. I heard a bang on the wall from my daughter's room, which was her just flipping over in her sleep. A few times I heard more noises from the screen to my window, but when I looked out I saw nothing. Then around 5:15 a.m. I heard a car door shut again, which could have just been my neighbor leaving for work, but I didn't see anything when I looked out the window, and I heard no more noises. To sum it up, I heard a lot of noises and found a dirty fork in the sink. I didn't see anyone, and nothing was disturbed. We have 3 couches in the basement set up to relax on, my escape spot for the kids. So, is it possible someone is breaking through the basement door and somehow sleeping on the couches? I haven't been down there to check, as I'm still scared. We have a Ring doorbell on the front, but it's been dead for a while, so I'm charging it up tonight. It's more believable to me that it's paranormal activity than a squatter. This area is super safe, and I just don't know or see how or why anyone would be here or do anything in our home. Nothing was taken, but this isn't the first time. I've had plenty of nights like this. I've had a few creepy things happen to me. At the time, my ex and our son had just moved into a house, fairly old, but nice overall. My sister and her boyfriend at the time also moved in, as at the time they needed an in-between home until they found their own place. The first odd thing we noticed was in my son's room. There was what looked like a child's painting of a sunflower with a name above it, which we thought was odd, because wouldn't that get painted over before new people moved in? Wasn't sure about the fundamentals of all that, so for the time being it wasn't bothering us, so we left it. Everything was fine for a while, but then a series of odd events began to occur. The first thing we noticed was on an afternoon when my girlfriend and I had the house to ourselves. We were laying down in bed preparing to take an afternoon nap when we heard the unmistakable sound of the pitter-patter from a child running through the hallway. Now, if you're a parent, I guarantee the sound is unmistakable when you hear it. We both looked at each other in surprise without saying a word, and we both recognized that the sound was exactly what we thought it was. I looked through the house. Nothing. The next incident was even odder. My son and I loved to watch Regular Show all through his early years. My son is around 3 during these events. I mean, we watched it all the time. It was our go-to show. I loved Pops, and so did my son. We even had a stuffed Benson doll. Well, one night we were all asleep. I had my PC and monitor close to the bed, when all of a sudden, without the monitor turning on at all, Regular Show just kicks on full blast in the middle of the night. Now, if you own a computer and understand that even if the show had opened up ready to go, if I'd have hit spacebar or something to unpause it in the monitor, it would at least turn on. If the PC was on sleep mode, which it was. However, none of the above were applicable, and yet the show was still turned on at max volume. I groggily get up confused, start messing with the computer until the screen isn't turning on, and suddenly it just stops with no explanation. And finally, the weirdest thing of all. So my son's room has a window which faced the front of the house, so whenever I returned home from work, he would often run into his window on the outside of the blinds and see me coming in. It always made my day to see that. Well, one day I'm pulling in from work, and there's the little baby boy right there at the window with his fingers on the glass looking at me. At the time, I sort of noticed he looked like he was in a shadow, almost as if he were hidden in black and white. I really didn't think anything of it at the time, but looking back, I couldn't help but notice that small detail. So I walk into the house and my sister's boyfriend is there. I ask how my son's been, and he looks at me confused and says that he's with my sister at the park with my girlfriend. I look at him confused and say I just saw him at the window. I walk into his room and there's no one there. But I knew I had just seen him, or at least I had seen a child there looking at me. It really stuck out with me. This is my story. All of it is true. My roommate and I had just moved to Denver. His name was Tyler. He was gay, and for the first time in his life, he was surrounded by other gay people. For the first few weeks, I didn't see much of him. He was getting as much ass as he could, and I was content in our apartment alone. Nothing about it freaked me out. A photo on my wall had fallen off, and that was strange, but I figured it was just gravity. Tyler finally stayed the night in the apartment. We were sharing a bed because he hadn't gotten one yet. We were both drunk, and that night, as soon as I turned off the lamp, the blinds started moving. Tyler was freaked out, but I was drunk and tired and brushed it off as just a breeze. He went and slept in the living room. I stayed in the bedroom and told him to chill out and that it was nothing. Nothing else happened that night. But we did bring it back up the next day. We both laughed. I said, "What should we name our ghost?" Tyler replied, "Bill." For the rest of the day, we continued to crack little jokes about Bill. That night, while getting ready into bed and about to turn off the lamp, Tyler whispered, "Bill doesn't like the dark." The blinds immediately started lashing all around. I turned the lamp back on, and we both sat up and just watched. I still wasn't convinced. He made me get out of bed to check where it was coming from because I wasn't scared. I looked for any kind of vent or open window, but nothing made sense. I had a little radio in the windowsill and it had fallen out. I put it back up, climbed back into bed and tried to calm Tyler. Again, I turned the lamp off. Then they started going again. But this time, with far more intensity. We stared, and this time I did get scared. I did what anyone who thinks they may be encountering something did. I tried to talk to it. "Do you want us to leave?" The blinds were still going crazy. At that point I was terrified. I jumped out of bed and packed a quick bag and headed to my childhood friend's house. I didn't sleep that night. I just shuddered in fear. Our next journey would be to try and figure out a way to get rid of Bill. We headed back to the apartment because we needed the internet to find an exorcist. I went into the house, shaking in fear, sitting on the floor in the corner. Tyler called a few churches. We didn't actually get any help. We got really confused responses. Tyler stands up and looks in the kitchen. He covers his mouth and slowly walks backwards. The burners were all on, all of them, on different settings. I ran out the house. Tyler followed suit after turning the burners off. We sat in the car panicking. "We have to call the leasing office and get the hell out of this lease," I said. That was an awkward phone call. The manager didn't believe us and thought we were idiots, but I told her everything stated above. She said that she would look into it and call us back. "I left my cigarettes in the house," Tyler cried. But screw that, I wasn't about to go back in there. He talked me into standing by the front door while he grabbed them. All of the water sources were on, every sink and shower in the apartment. I'm hysterical at this point and run to the car. "We have to turn the water off, dude." I collected myself and walked to the door again with him. Perfect timing. 2 leasing ladies came down because we were the talk of the office. I asked her to please turn off the water because we were too scared. We all stood inside by the front door and told them the whole story. One of them put her hand over the burner. "They're still warm." They didn't make that up. They kind of believed us, but not really. Well, that's not until the maintenance guy encountered Bill. Todd. Apparently after we left, Todd and his co-worker were walking past my apartment. He said he was laughing with them about our story. Right as he walked by, the deadbolt locked. He looked at the other guy, and then he grabbed his keys. No one's supposed to be in there. Bit weird. He knocked on the door for a while, but no one came. So he stuck his set of keys into the door, and it felt like someone was holding the deadbolt shut. He couldn't open it. He tried the balcony door as we were on the first floor, and that wouldn't unlock either. He tried again with the front door, and then it unlocked with ease. After that point, they actually believed us, and allowed us to live in a different apartment. The next day sucked. I had to repack again, but I couldn't stay in the house because I was just terrified to death. I had some guy who wanted to sleep with me move everything for me. We spent the entire day moving, and I laid on the dining room floor with a boy who liked me. It honestly just felt good to be held. I played in his arms, and I watched the blinds slowly close by themselves. I cried. Moving didn't help. We did all of that stuff for nothing, and now I'm in a layout I hate. We continued to try and find a way to get rid of Bill ourselves. That included blacking out every night and mocking it. Ugh, we were so stupid. We bought some more sticker decal to decorate our rooms. He bought a big Paris sticker which he stuck and put on our wall. It ripped off. We put it back up. It peeled right off. I thought it could just be the wall paint because I was trying to think logically like a normal person, and nothing else happened on the first day. But then it escalated. Bill would pound on our bedroom wall from the minute we laid down to about 10 a.m. every night. We'd hardly sleep. I even laid by the wall to make sure it wasn't Tyler messing with me. One night, my upstairs neighbor came down very upset. It was super fun to try and explain to my neighbor that it wasn't us banging on the walls. It was some sort of demon asshole thing. I even brought him into my room. He saw it with his own eyes and said, "Must be a raccoon in your wall or something." Yeah, a raccoon. People really don't want to believe in ghosts, do they? It messed with us to the point where we were scared and we couldn't sleep. It would change the shower water to scalding hot, throw lit candles off counters and just do lots of annoying stuff. But things started to get worse when Tyler finally saw it. I couldn't find him. It was almost bedtime, so he was going around the house turning off the lights. I didn't see him again. "Tyler?" No response. "Tyler, where are you? Why are the lights off?" I turned the bedroom light on. He was in bed, bundled up, completely covered. "What are you doing?" He wouldn't look at me. "Tyler, I'm getting scared." I saw him. I was so scared. I couldn't explain what kind of fear I felt. "Where?" I tried comforting him. He was crying. "In the bathroom. I went to turn off the light. He was right there." He had no eyes. We both sat up in the corner of the bedroom all night. We did act like total idiots and let our friends stay the night, and they didn't believe us. We would mock it and watch it thrash around mirrors and bang the walls, and they would stare in awe. God, we were really stupid. We couldn't do this anymore. We needed help. I ended up writing to a ghost hunter show, and she wanted to fly out to film if things escalated, but we couldn't wait. In the meantime, she did refer me to some guy who I'll call Zach. We met Zach at a local diner and explained everything. He came over to the house but couldn't sense a thing. He told us it was unlikely it was a ghost, that he'd been doing it for 20 years and only once encountered one, and it was because a family member was trapped there with some voodoo stuff. He said it was likely an entity. I still don't really understand what that means, but I knew it was real, and he gave us some directions on how to get rid of whatever it is. He told us to get salt and some other things, put them in bowls in the corner of the rooms of the house, to burn some sage, to open all the windows around us and to yell, "Get out," but to not do it lightly, no laughing, that we had to mean it. He said if anything new happened, to document it and report back to him. He told us to never acknowledge or talk about it in the house, and to never give it a name. Oops. That night, my childhood friend and boyfriend and Tyler all began the process. No one laughed. The energy around us was tense and silent. We did what we had to do and went out for pizza. These things only awoke the beast even more. We got home late and I went to the bathroom. The ball of salt had been flipped over. I was confused and went to check the others. They were all flipped over. When we left, we put the sage in a kitchen drawer. When we got home, it was shredded all over the floor, like you could do it with your bare hands or whatever. The drawer was still open. Later that night, Tyler and I were on the couch watching TV when he starts crying and pointing to the kitchen. "Look!" I didn't see anything. "He's right there, can't you see him?" No, thank God, because I don't know if my heart could handle that. As soon as Tyler would look away, he said, "Bill disappeared." He was so scared and asked me to get him a soda. I didn't want to, but I understood his fear. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed it. One of the salt bins was ripped open. Again. I don't even know how that happened. It was lying on its side. Obviously, neither of us had done it. We had both reached maximum creep out at this point. It didn't take long for everything to escalate to a point where we could no longer deal with it. So Tyler and I tried to spend as little time as possible in the apartment. Sometimes we even ended up sleeping in the car. The activity was getting insane, things being thrown, and it was simply too challenging to deal with life at this point. I'll cut a long story short here. Tyler and I got into a huge falling out. I don't want to say what it was about, but he showed his true colors, and after that, I didn't want to have anything to do with him. Tyler ended up moving out. And once he did, everything ceased. I can't make this up. It was like a weight had been lifted over me and the apartment. The ambience of it felt completely different. I had a final conversation with Zach, who told me that he was pretty sure that would happen, as he was relatively certain that the entity, whatever it was attached to Tyler. I don't know what happens to Tyler now, but I do have severe PTSD, even just remembering this. It's a bit anticlimactic, really, him leaving and everything stopping, but I am truly so grateful that it did end once he left. I could move on with my life, but I do have quite severe PTSD. I can't even watch scary stories anymore, and can't sleep without a nightlight. Who knows what Tyler did to attach that entity to him? Maybe it was always in the apartment waiting for someone to latch onto, but in any case, I'm glad that I'm free of it. My black cat Smokey, who was my best friend, passed away 6 years ago. I remember the day I got her. We arrived at this lovely couple's home to adopt a tabby kitten for my brother. My twin sister and I, who were 9 years old at the time, loved the show Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and we desperately wanted a black cat, and they happened to have some black kittens, but said that they couldn't seem to find them, and they think that the female kitten was hiding, because she was the most shy of the lot. We were so upset, and as we could not wait any longer, we got into the car with my brother's tabby, and as we were about to drive away, we heard someone calling and running towards us holding a little black kitten. They found her just before we left. It was like fate. From then on, it was the start of an unbreakable bond that will carry on after death and into our next lives together, as I believe she is one of my angels who was sent down to keep me going and not give up on life, as I would continue to struggle with severe depression, social anxiety, and suicidal thoughts and attempts, which she would make me stop from. Before I'd swallowed too many pills, she'd either threaten to eat them herself or lie on top of them. What I realized was that she felt like an outsider, as did I. She was not social and very shy of new people, and she hated other cats. I never knew why until much later. She also moved from one person in my family to the next, not too sure who to settle for until I was the last one she spent time with to see if I was the right fit. And it was. She stuck to me like glue from then on. She'd follow me around the house like a dog. My family would laugh at the two of us, and she wouldn't allow me out of her sight. How she'd wait at the door for me to go home from school and run towards me, meowing loudly as I returned. She would call me before bed, if I was up past 10 p.m. "We have to go to bed, meow me," waking me up a few minutes before my alarm would go off around 5 a.m. so that I could let her out and use the sand toilet. She'd be back soon, watching me put my shoes on and swat at the laces, or listening to me babble about the crazy dreams I'd had. Once I came home in tears. I'd had the worst day. I was terribly bullied at school and I wanted to end my life, so I sobbed and sobbed, my face in my pillows, and she hopped on the bed next to me and lied next to me. I went to cuddle her, put my arms around her and my face in her fur. She was my comfort, and since I didn't have a good relationship with my mother nor siblings, she was both when I needed it. I was disappointed when she got up in irritation and went to lie further away. I just stayed there. I was with my arms still crossed around an open space where her body was moments ago. I think about how alone I was a lot. She would surprisingly come back and stood there for a while, and I glanced from the corner of my eye to look down at her, with those green, kind eyes, as if she were deep in contemplation. She walked over and laid in my arms and started purring furiously, which wasn't like her at all. She hated being snuggled unless it was for scratches. I felt warmth move through her to me, and I knew that she was being selfless and was concerned for me, and felt guilty for leaving me when I needed her the most. She made the choice to come over and purr and cuddle with me like a mother cat would for an injured kitten, and it warmed my heart. She even loved small critters. I had a hamster that my brother said was aggressive called Kimmy. She was gentle and sweet with me. She was fat and brown, a teddy bear hamster, and Smokey was obsessed with this tiny bear. They became best friends. Kimmy wasn't like other hamsters. There was no wing to her. She was playful and silly. It was winter. I told her I was going to go to bed and stroked her. She was weak and old at this point. She fell over, and it broke my heart, but I knew she was old and had arthritis at this point. I carried her to bed, planning to take her to the vet in the morning. She was fine the whole day until now, and we cuddled as we normally did, and in the morning she woke me up as she usually did too. I got up and thought something was different. I went to let her out. Just before she walked away, I knelt down and stroked her and asked if she was okay. I was worried about her and told her it's too cold to go out now and that she should hurry back to bed. When she left, I checked my phone. 3 a.m., much earlier than usual. I felt sadness and concern as I got back under the covers. I waited until that evening, not able to sleep. She still never returned, and then I knew. I went outside and called and called and called. The neighbors came out and asked if I'd like to help, and she hugged me and told me that she was sorry. She knew we loved each other very much and said how sad it must be. I knew she wouldn't be coming home. I cried on her shoulder because I didn't get to say a proper goodbye. As some of you may know, some cats like to leave when they know they're dying. I believe lions do this too. They like to go die alone and in peace. After we walked around for another hour calling, I went home. My fears realized. She never came home for a whole week. I looked everywhere and occasionally looking in the cupboards as she loved to sleep there. I was torn up and thought that I never got to say goodbye and was very upset by it. We'd been together for so many years. She'd watched me grow into a young adult, saved my life more than she knew, and I missed her every day and didn't stop crying at night thinking of her. Then it happened. I went to bed. I closed my window and my bedroom door and switched off the light and got in bed. I had literally just laid down and put my alarm on. Bear in mind that it had probably been a little over half a year since her passing when I closed my eyes, when I immediately felt something jump on the bed. I got a fright. I jumped and sat up and looked around to lay back down, thinking I was imagining things. Then I felt something walk next to my legs, up towards me, and I froze. I was petrified, but not paralyzed. I didn't know if I should look or ignore it. I thought to myself, please don't be a demon. I had seen plenty of shadow people and had scary experiences in my life, and I certainly didn't need more. That's when I felt paws walking on my thighs and onto my chest. Wait, what is this? I squinted and there was a cat figure, whiskers and all. It walked onto my chest, purring. It was Smokey. I could recognize that soft, loving purr anywhere. I looked up, very excited, and then went to touch her, and poof, she was gone. But I felt so much love and joy, and the tears were rolling down my cheeks. It was stupid of me to think that I could touch her, but the fact she chose to visit me in such a physical, vivid way, while I was fully awake, showed the trust we'd always had between us. It was special. I just said, thank you. I love you, Smokey. I hope whoever reads or hears this has a pet person / guardian angel to know that they're always there with you and will never leave your side. I'm a 40-year-old male, but when this happened I was 24 years old. It even makes me old to say this, but Facebook hadn't even become popular yet, and I had never heard of MySpace. Well, I started a Facebook account to keep up with my family all over the state, and in other states. 3 days after I started that Facebook account, This woman that looked my age sent me a friend request. I thought she was beautiful, so I accepted her request. Soon after we started talking, her name was Tanya. After speaking for a few weeks, we went out on a date. No, this isn't where it gets weird yet. Me and Tanya dated for about a month before I got to meet her 2 kids. A few weeks later, I met her parents, and she met my family. It was going really well with Tanya, and it was like a match made in heaven. On the weekends, I would sleep over her house and we would take the kids out to the movies, eat out, and even Tainsville State Park. We got along so great, I even got along great with her kids and family. When I talked to her dad if I could marry his daughter, yes, I'm old-fashioned, he said that I could. Well, I went and bought the ring, called up Tanya and asked if we could go out to eat the following weekend. This is the part where it starts getting weird. That weekend I was nervous. I couldn't wait and left my house so that I could be on hers on time. But when I got there it was all boarded up, so I went to her parents' house. Her father asked, "Can I help you?" So I asked what happened to Tanya. What happened to the house? Where were they? Did it catch fire? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He asked how I knew his great-great-great-great-grandmother, and how did I know the house burnt down? I asked what he was speaking about, and I was saying, no, not your great-great-great-great-grandma. Your daughter, I have pictures to prove it. And I scrolled through my phone to show him pictures that were supposed to be of me and her, but it turns out they were of just me, and my family never recalled meeting her either. I don't believe in ghosts, but what happened to me in that year changed me. I just don't know. We had a cat called Zoe who sadly passed away in February of 2019 from cancer. She was exceptionally close to my son and extremely gentle with him, even when he was a boisterous toddler. It was his first real encounter with death, and at 4 years old he was able to understand the finality of it. One night in the spring of 2019, my son woke me at around 2 or 3 a.m. to say that one of the cats was on the bed and awoken him. He asked if I could get the cat off the bed, as it was disturbing his sleep. We had 2 remaining cats at the time, a big grey cat and a white cat named Jack, and a black cat named Minerva. Jack was sleeping on the bed with my husband and I, so I figured it might be Minerva. As I came down to my son's bedroom, not only did I see Minerva sleeping on the couch, but I also discovered that his door was closed, both cats accounted for. I opened his bedroom door to investigate the room. For what? I'm not sure, seeing as both cats I'd already seen. I explained to my son that his door was closed and both cats were outside his room. Was he certain he saw the cat? He said yes, that she was right at the foot of his bed, but he didn't see her anymore. He had put the blankets over his head and tried to get some sleep, and when he looked after that, the cat was gone. He didn't have a nightlight, so his room was very dark, and he couldn't make out any detail, which is why he didn't know which cat it was. He said it was the silhouette. As far as we could tell, it was the ghost of Zoe coming to visit my son that night to make sure he was okay, just as she did when he was alive. He feels guilty he didn't give her a more enthusiastic response, but since he didn't know it was one of our existing cats, he didn't know to. To this day, he says he hopes that she comes to visit again, so perhaps he can interact with her and let her know how much she is missed. Okay, I think me and my grandma can see spirits. Let me fill you in. It's not all the time and we don't have any family history of psychosis. Some of the creepy things I did as a kid convinced me. I remember when I was 6 or 7 and I used to get really animated and excited every time my mum drove past the graveyard. She told me she'd hear me from the back seat say, "Mum, look, a graveyard. Look at what's going on over there." And there was no one out there, but it was creepy. But the one instance I know was another experience that I had at that age. For some southern reason, we went to tour an old plantation including the slave quarters. I was the only person of color in my class. They were all excited, but I felt uneasy. I had never been told about slavery or anything at that time, so to me it was just an old house. But when we stepped inside, I saw this woman. There was a lady in a black gown that had a scowl that did not like us kids being in her house. I say that it was more like recalling a memory in my mind, rather than seeing her directly like my classmates. But I know I'd never been here or seen this lady before, but I instantly knew what she looked like. I told my teacher there was a lady who was mad at us for being here at the top of the staircase. She dismissed it. As the tour guide took us around the house, which is now a museum, I saw a portrait of the lady. I shouted that I'd seen her before, and the guide looked confused, but kept on rambling. This was the wife of the house who lived here in the year 1850. At the end of the tour, we go to the slave's house, which was really step on a ramp and peer inside. There was only one house, but it had 2 rooms divided by an open doorway on the inside. The second I looked inside, I started crying. They were looking at me. There were a bunch of people in brown clothes looking at me, and they stood up against the wall stiff, scared to move. All the men were on one side of the room, and in the next all the women. They saw me back. 1 or 2 men gave me looks of contempt. Looking back, it might have been an association of my slightly lighter skin with the household slave. And when the white kids began to noisily stick their heads beside me, they stopped making the face and stood against the wall. All of their demeanors were a combination of tense hypervigilance, worry, and a mental state you disassociate into when you have a form response. They weren't as hostile as the lady in the black dress. I didn't get a vibe that they were dangerous or anything. I just didn't expect to see them there, and they all looked so miserable. I was a mess, and of course, as the only kid of colour there, the optics looked bad. So they got me a honey stick from the gift shop to quell me on the ride back to school. When I told my grandma about it, she sat me down and told me about slavery. She didn't say she didn't believe me. She just told me that's what it used to be like. Understanding made me feel a little bit at ease. But that's the moment spirits made a lasting impact on me. I still don't like going into some older buildings, but even if I sense them, they just give off neutral vibes. No one really sad or evil like in the movies, and definitely not like the sad and evil I saw that day. An ex of mine had a young son who had a tendency to sit up at night and talk to his friend. No biggie, kids in their imaginations, right? One day the girlfriend and I ordered a pizza, set up a movie, and the kid gets washed for bed. In his bath, I asked if he was ready to go to sleep, and he said that it would be lonely. I asked why, and he said his friend left. Fast forward 30 minutes, as I kill the lights to his bedroom and say goodnight, he turns to me with the biggest grin on his face and say, "He's here. He's back." That was when the doorbell rang. I about crapped my pants. Turns out it was just the pizza guy.